Chapter 287. With Shui Xiang's angry rebuke, a strong wind blew on the surface of the sea. The sea wind howled and the waves roared. Since the sun set, the vast Pacific Ocean seemed to have never been calm. In just a few breaths, the strong wind swept away the billowing smoke caused by the explosion. Then Shui Xiang's figure slowly emerged from the thick smoke. Although she was bombarded by the United States, there was no sign of injury on her body, as if she was not here at all. In fact, Shui Xiang's appearance was beautiful, but she always faintly gave people a feeling of acrimony and being unapproachable. In the words of the aunt in the park who arranged a blind date for her son, it was, "This girl's face was not good. She would jinx her husband. Marrying her home would shorten his lifespan." As for whether Shui Xiang jinxed her husband or not, obviously, no one knew the answer to this question. However, Chen Shi and Qin Shuai, who were onlookers, knew very well that the group of United States people in front of them were all going to become short-lived ghosts. Shui Xiang floated in the air expressionlessly. Her face, which looked a little rosy just now, became a little pale at the moment. She looked like a sick patient in the hospital. Of course, she was not sick. If Qing Wan and Bai Hong were still here, they would immediately dodge to the side and carefully keep a safe distance from her. After all, a woman was very scary when she went crazy. Because of the existence of the protective shield, this level of bombardment was actually no different from scratching an itch for Shui Xiang. And the reason why she was so angry was entirely because she didn't expect that these damn ants would dare to provoke her again and again. She felt as if a mangy dog was barking around her, and from time to time, it would pounce on her and bite her. Even if it couldn't bite her, it still successfully disgusted her. Therefore, when Shui Xiang waved her sleeves again with a cold face, the surrounding temperature seemed to have dropped a lot. Then the sea surface where the United States soldiers were located surged violently. Immediately afterward, a huge force suddenly surged out from the bottom of the sea. Before the soldiers could react, they were directly sprayed into the sky by this force. Thrusters. Spread out, spread out. Attack at will. With the help of the thrusters, the soldiers were like hornets flying up and down in the air. At the same time, they were crazily firing at Shui Xiang's location. Boom. In an instant, bullets gushed out like raindrops. At the same time, countless rocket launchers were launched one after another at Shui Xiang. A new round of suppressive fire began. However, just as they were about to launch their attacks, the sea beneath them suddenly began to boil. Countless tiny water arrows shot out from the sea at an extremely fast speed, looking somewhat like a fountain. A dense rain of water arrows shot from the sea into the sky. Because a soldier couldn't dodge in time, he was pierced by those tiny water arrows on the spot. Accompanied by a heart-wrenching scream, the unlucky soldier fell from the sky like a wild goose that had been shot by an arrow. Pull up. Pull up. The thrusters were fully activated, and the remaining soldiers instantly flew hundreds of meters into the air. But it was a pity. Although their flying speed was fast, the water arrows shot from the sea were much faster than them. Therefore, in just a few seconds, more than half of this elite team whose combat power could be said to be the world's top elite team had been killed or injured. Calling headquarters, requesting. Seeing that the situation was not right, the leading soldier immediately wanted to ask for support from headquarters. But before he could even finish speaking, a water arrow comparable to a laser directly pierced through the exoskeleton armor on his body. Blood rained down, and the entire world was quiet. Shui Xiang turned her head again, and looked at the two people not far away. This was already the fourth time she looked at Chen Shi and Qin Shuai. Therefore, Qin Shuai suddenly felt like he was being stared at by a prehistoric beast. This also made him finally realize that death was so close to him. Under Shui Xiang's expressionless gaze, Qin Shuai didn't even dare to breathe. Every second felt like a year. But luckily for him, after Shui Xiang stared at them for a full 3 seconds, she didn't attack the two of them. Instead, she spat out a word coldly. "Get out!" Hearing this, Qin Shuai suddenly felt like he had been pardoned. In a moment of excitement, he grabbed Chen Shi's arm a little rudely, and then quickly whispered, "Mr. Chen, let's go if we don't go now. I'm afraid we won't be able to leave." To be honest, if it weren't for Chen Shi's reluctance to leave, he would have already run away like Ijiro Saito, It was fine to watch the show, but he couldn't throw his life away, right? Perhaps sensing the fear in Qin Shuai's heart, Qin Shi didn't mean to blame him. Instead, he reached out and patted the back of his hand. You go first, I still have something to talk to her alone. Before Qin Shuai could react, an invisible force pushed him out. Mr. Chen. You. Qin Shuai struggled, wanting to say something, but his mouth was blocked by Chen Shi's true essence. This scene also made Shui Xiang, who had been expressionless, instantly change her expression. This man, who didn't have the slightest fluctuation of spirit energy on his body, was actually a celestial being? Did she make an error in judgment? Shui Xiang was a little bewildered. But at this time, Chen Shi was like a tourist climbing a mountain. Step by step, he walked in the air and slowly rose to Shui Xiang's height. Who are you? Until now, Shui Xiang hadn't noticed any signs of spirit energy fluctuations on Chen Shi's body. How was this possible? Shui Xiang frowned slightly, and the expression on her face couldn't help but become much more dignified. Chen Shi heard Shui Xiang's question, but he didn't mean to answer. Instead, he asked, Do you know there is a weapon in this world called a nuclear bomb? What is it? It seems that you don't know. Looking at Shui Xiang's puzzled face, Chen Shi didn't mean to explain. Instead, he continued, Actually, I'm very curious. Can you withstand a nuclear bomb attack? Hearing this, a trace of displeasure flashed across Shui Xiang's face. Although she didn't know what a nuclear bomb was, since the man in front of her mentioned the word weapon and attack, it naturally aroused her vigilance. Pretending to be mysterious, then I'll test how strong you are. Following a cold snort, Shui Xiang's slender hand moved, and a water arrow suddenly shot out from the sea. Seeing this, Chen Shi didn't move at all. Instead, he said calmly, Under normal circumstances, I don't fight with women. But in order to avoid unnecessary trouble in the future, I can only tell you today, I'm sorry. As his voice fell, a long sword suddenly appeared in Chen Shi's hand. Dharma. Chapter 288. Shui Xiang couldn't help but frown the moment she saw the appearance of the godly sword Dharma form. You actually used the Dharma form as a weapon? There was some doubt in her tone, but at the same time, there was some amazement. Without a doubt, Shui Xiang understood the usage of the Dharma form very well. But it was precisely because of this that she felt rather surprised. Dharma form? It could actually be used like this? Shui Xiang had never seen anyone use the Dharma form as a weapon since she started cultivating. Could it be that this mysterious man in front of her didn't even have a suitable Dharma treasure weapon? Or was it because this man didn't even put her in his eyes, so he didn't even want to use a Dharma treasure? The moment this conjecture appeared in Shui Xiang's mind, she couldn't suppress the raging anger in her heart. He was just an ant from the lower realm, and he actually dared to look down on her like this? He was simply arrogant to the extreme. I originally didn't want to kill more people, but you insisted on committing suicide. Since that's the case, then I'll do as you wish and personally send you on your way. As her voice fell, Shui Xiang stretched out her right hand and pointed fiercely at Chen Shi. Then, the aqua-blue cloak that had been wrapped around her hand suddenly seemed to come alive. After it circled around her arm, it was like a little blue snake that shot straight towards Chen Shi. The so-called cloak referred to the silk and satin gauze that ancient women wrapped around their arms. It could also be called a long damask and was purely a decorative item. The woman held the cloak in her hand. When she stood, the cloak naturally hung down like a calm pool of water. When she walked, it fluttered and stretched like a willow tree in the wind. How beautiful was the combination of movement and stillness. Shui Xiang danced with the long damask, like a fairy flying out of a Dunhuang mural. Seeing this, Chen Shi didn't have the slightest intention of underestimating her. Instead, he gripped the hilt of his sword tightly and ferociously channeled all the vital energy in his body into the long sword. So much so that the long sword in his hand suddenly glowed with a strong light. And the reason why Chen Shi was so cautious was because this cloak was Shui Xiang's natal Dharma treasure, azure billowing silk gauze. After the long damask flew out from Shui Xiang's hand, it suddenly became bigger and instantly became like a curtain that covered the entire sky. Seeing that the situation was not right, Chen Shi immediately rose into the air, wanting to fly out of the area covered by the long silk. However, what Qinshi did not expect was that Changling's speed was quite fast. It was like a big net falling from the sky, covering Qinshi's head in an instant. Then it tightened bit by bit like wrapping a dumpling, wrapping Qinshi firmly. Qinshi brandished his long sword, trying to split the long silk. However, this long silk seemed to be made of water. After the sword pierced into it, it did not encounter any resistance. No matter how Qinshi slashed, the long silk did not show any signs of damage. Qinshi tried to touch the long silk with his hand, wanting to tear it apart. However, he found that the long silk had become extraordinarily sturdy. No matter how hard he tried, it was futile. It could be said to be both soft and hard. In the face of this unbreakable long silk, Qinshi had no way to break it. He could only watch as he was wrapped in the long silk like a mummy. Looking at how the azure billowing silk gauze tied up Qinshi so easily, Shui Xiang could not help but laugh contemptuously. You only have this little ability? She thought that this man might have some ability. She did not expect that he was just a guy who was strong in appearance but weak in reality. It may be more than that. Even though he was tied up like a dumpling, Qinshi's face still did not show any expression of panic. Instead, he calmly replied to her, "You don't know life from death." Shui Xiang glanced at him and then waved her arm. An icicle suddenly appeared not far from Qinshi's forehead. Looking at that posture, Shui Xiang probably wanted to use the icicle to cut open his head. However, at this critical juncture, Qinshi did not seem to be anxious at all. Instead, he suddenly smiled and said, "Let me give you a piece of advice. When you are fighting with others, don't let your guard down, especially behind you." Hearing this, Shui Xiang could not help but frown and quickly turned to look behind her. At this time, she found that the divine sword Dharma idol was not far behind her when she did not know when. The divine sword was slightly blooming with a strange light, but Shui Xiang could not detect any signs of spiritual energy fluctuations on this sword at all. Until, when the divine sword Dharma idol suddenly flew toward her, Shui Xiang finally realized that it contained a huge amount of spiritual energy. You, shameless. A lion would use all its strength to hunt a rabbit. Even if the opponent was a woman, even if the method used was despised, Qinshi still chose to take her down in a way that was close to a sneak attack. In fact, when Shui Xiang was fighting with the group of United States guys just now, Qinshi had quietly set up a large aura-concealing array, and used it to show weakness to the enemy in order to catch them off guard. Shui Xiang was indeed tricked. Perhaps she did not even think that this man, in addition to being far more powerful than her, would actually use a sneak attack method. When the aura-concealing array could not hide the spiritual energy fluctuations contained in the divine sword Dharma idol, Shui Xiang finally realized how terrifying this man in front of her was. Setting the universe as the god, the Qianquan sword finger. Man and earth worship heaven for the heavenly sword. The three famous swords, heavenly sword. The first move was a killing move. Shui Xiang's reaction was also very fast. With a wave of her arm, the long silk immediately flew out from Qinshi's body. The spiritual energy fluctuations on the divine sword Dharma idol gave her a lot of pressure. Shui Xiang did not think that she could steadily take this sword with just the protective aura, so she quickly recalled the long silk. But it was a pity. Qinshi obviously would not give her this opportunity. Therefore, with a thought, the divine sword Dharma idol suddenly cut through the sky like a bolt of lightning, and instantly came in front of Shui Xiang. The sword was 3 feet long. A green rainbow pierced the sky. Under Qinshi's killing move that had been accumulating power for a long time, Shui Xiang did not even have time to react. The divine sword Dharma idol directly broke through the protective aura, and directly pierced through her slender body. At this time, the long silk that came late finally returned to Shui Xiang's hands. Shui Xiang lowered her head and stared blankly at her abdomen. This sword, it directly pierced through her body and at the same time, shattered her middle dantian. However, after all, she was in existence above the heavens. Although the injury was very serious, as long as it was treated in time, there was still a chance for recovery. But, would Qinshi give her this chance? Shui Xiang instinctively wanted to escape. But when she felt the surging spiritual energy fluctuations behind her, Shui Xiang made a completely different choice from Changli's. As a result, Shui Xiang suddenly let out a shrill and high-pitched scream. Immediately after, the long silk on her arms suddenly danced, and then wrapped around her body again and again. At the same time, the spiritual energy in Shui Xiang's body also began to fluctuate violently, and as the spiritual energy in her body continued to flow out, the surrounding temperature also suddenly dropped. After the long silk had completely wrapped Shui Xiang, her body began to freeze. Just like in the movie The Day After Tomorrow, the extremely cold aura that flowed out from Shui Xiang's body almost instantly froze the sea. Then, a huge ice block appeared in front of Chen Shi. This woman. Chapter 289. The spirit qi that overflowed from Shui Xiang's body seemed to have a strange magical power. Under the influence of the spirit qi, the blue and magnificent sea began to gradually freeze at a speed visible to the naked eye. Therefore, in a short while the sea that Chen Shi could see had all turned into polar glaciers. Perhaps it was because the temperature had dropped too much. When the extremely cold aura spread out with Shui Xiang as the center, even the waves of the sea maintained their original shape, as if they had become Tianshan snow lotuses of all shapes and sizes. Facing such a strange scene, even Chen Shi could not help but be amazed. Shui Xiang turned into a lump of ice and floated in the air. After the ocean below was frozen, the ice that sealed Shui Xiang also fell heavily from the sky. Bang! The huge ice hit the ice and immediately splashed a lot of ice chips. At the same time, countless spiderweb-like cracks appeared on the ice. Seeing this, Chen Shi could not help but frown slightly. Immediately after, he raised the long sword in his hand and slashed at the ice in the air. A green sword light burst out and hit the ice block in an instant. But what surprised Chen Shi was that this sword did not leave any trace on the ice. In fact, there wasn't even a single scratch on his skin. How could this be an ice cube? It was like the vibranium shield in the hands of Captain America. It was a super hard metal that only existed in science fiction movies. No wonder Shui Xiang did not choose to escape after being injured, but chose to freeze herself. Come to think of it, this was her last life-saving means. Chen Shi came to the ice, reached out and knocked on the ice, then thoughtfully dispersed the divine sword Dharma in his hand. This ice contained most of the true qi that Shui Xiang had obtained over the years, so it became so hard. Although Chen Shi could break the ice and forcibly dig Shui Xiang out of the ice, it would take a certain amount of time. Therefore, after thinking about it, he decisively threw this idea to the back of his mind. In fact, Chen Shi was not the kind of devil who would kill everyone once he made a move. The reason why he attacked Shui Xiang was mainly because he wanted the three of them to stay on Earth temporarily, and use this to buy himself some time. Last time, in order to help Yingying find the silver immortal soul, Chen Shi directly killed the clan elder and Changli. However, he did not silence them, so the entire village knew of his existence. Fortunately, Wu Lian had already recruited most of the villagers, so as long as Wu Lian issued a gag order, there shouldn't be any more problems. In addition, based on the previously known clues, it was obvious that the divine gate was not something that could be opened at will. Once he cut off all the clues, even if the gate of heaven opened again, what could he do? Could it be that he really had to find this murderer in this vast sea of people? Was that even possible? Chen Shi calculated carefully. It wasn't because he realized that there might be a holy land of immortal cultivation that was comparable to the heavenly spiral continent behind the heavenly gates that he was afraid of. It was because he didn't want to cause trouble. Just like what he usually said when he taught Nian. We don't cause trouble, but we're not afraid of trouble. Right now, he simply wanted to give his wife and children a stable and happy family. This was the only thing he wanted to pursue for the rest of his life. Thinking of this, Chen Shi took out the satellite phone that Wu Lian gave him during the last mission, and then called his sister-in-law. Qin Shui seemed to have reported what happened here to the headquarters. Therefore, when Qin Xueqing received Chen Shi's call, she directly asked, "Do you need backup?" "No, it's more or less settled." Chen Shi told his sister-in-law his thoughts as he slowly walked around the ice block. Shui Xiang had already sealed herself in ice. If there was no external help, she probably wouldn't be able to wake up for 3 to 5 years. The three of them worked together. Now that something had happened to Shui Xiang, the other two must have received the news. Since that was the case, Then let's wait for the rabbit to appear. After a few simple words with his sister-in-law, Chunxi hung up the phone. Immediately after, a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Chunxi sat cross-legged next to the ice block and silently cultivated. After a while, a green light swept over from the distant horizon. The man in green was called Qing Wan, so the one in white was obviously Bai Hong. Qing Wan was the first to return to the location of the strong light. Chunxi noticed his arrival, so he raised his head to look at the situation. But at this moment, Qing Wan's voice was like a thunderclap, resounding through the entire sky. "You're the one who hurt Shui Xiang?" His voice was very low, and there was a hint of anger that seemed to be on the verge of being unable to suppress. Chunxi raised his head slightly. Just as he was about to answer, Qing Wan suddenly stretched out his right hand. Immediately after, a long spear suddenly appeared in his hand. Seeing that Qing Wan was about to start a fight, Chunxi hurriedly waved his hand and shook his head to explain. "It's not me, it's the group of United States guys who did it." Hearing this, Qing Wan couldn't help but be stunned. He didn't seem to understand Chunxi's meaning, so a suspicious expression suddenly appeared on his face. Seeing this, Chunxi immediately struck while the iron was hot and explained. "The group of United States guys threw a nuclear bomb. This girl couldn't withstand it, so she turned herself into ice. Here, it's this." After that, Chunxi reached out and pointed at the huge ice block next to him. Qing Wan didn't speak. The expression on his face was a little uncertain, as if he couldn't figure out whether what Chunxi said was true or false. So after thinking for a while, Qing Wan flew down from the sky, and then carefully looked at the ice block in front of him. "Nuclear bomb, do you know about it? That's the most powerful weapon in the world. With a boom, it can erupt with a temperature higher than the sun. Then this girl became like this. Weapon? There is such a magic weapon in the lower realm? Why have I never heard of it?" Qing Wan was completely frightened by Chunxi, so he held the long spear in his hand and carefully observed the fluctuation of spirit nearby. Seeing this, Chunxi smiled without saying anything. He was not teasing Qing Wan because he was bored, but because he wanted to use this opportunity to understand whether the connection between the three of them was close, and use this opportunity to find out if there was also a supreme magic weapon in the Heavenly Gate that could go back in time and explore the past like in the Heavenly Jade world. Judging from Qing Wan's reaction, the result was obvious. The connection between them was actually only to the extent of whether the other party was in danger. From this point of view, these ancient cultivators were even worse than soldiers on the modern battlefield. There was no spirit fluctuation on Chunxi's body, so Qing Wan didn't take him seriously at all. Instead, he looked at all suspicious things around him. However, just as Chunxi was about to repeat the same trick and take down Qing Wan in one fell swoop, a white sword light with shocking power fell from the sky and slashed directly at the position where Chunxi was. Seeing this, Chunxi didn't panic at all. He grasped in the air and raised his hand. A green sword light went against the sky and collided fiercely with the white sword light in mid-air. The surging vital essence suddenly collided in mid-air, and the invisible shock wave even caused the ice below to separate and collapse on the spot. In an instant, the sword chi on the endless ice surface was crisscrossed, and ice chips shot in all directions, like a sudden polar ice storm. Chunxi held the divine sword Dharma idol in his hand, looked up at the white figure in the air, and couldn't help but smile slightly. Chapter 290. His white robe fluttered as he floated over. Before the person arrived, the sword had arrived. Just like what Gulong described in the first sentence of the Sword of the Third Young Master. The sword aura spanned 30,000 miles, and the light of the sword chilled 19 provinces. Bai Hong was indeed as his name suggested. The moment he appeared, he was like a white rainbow, instantly taking away all the colors between heaven and earth, so that the entire world seemed to be left with only that white figure. However, when Bai Hong saw Chunxi casually receive his sword strike, he didn't attack again. Instead, he suddenly lowered his head, saying to Qing Wan, who still didn't understand the situation, "From when we left until now, it has only been the time of a cup of tea. The Divine Gate is here." But Shui Xiang did not directly return to the Divine Gate. Instead, she chose to freeze herself here. "Qing Wan, what do you think?" Why did she do that? Hearing this, Qing Wan could not help but be stunned. After thinking for a while, he frowned and asked, why? Because she did not even have the chance to escape. Bai Hong slowly floated to Qing Wan's side. The two stood side by side, and then both of them looked at Qin Shi. Looking carefully, one could see that Qing Wan's eyes were full of suspicion and vigilance, while Bai Hong's eyes were full of surprise. I did not expect that there would be such an expert in the lower realm. Changli, I'm afraid you have already killed him? Changli. Hearing this, Qin Shi raised his eyebrows and said with a smile, quite a poetic name, but I feel that this name does not seem to match his appearance. This seemingly nonsensical answer was actually an indirect admission of the matter. Changli had already died under his sword. He was the divine general that the elders had invited using the spirit-binding formation. It had to be said that Changli was very unlucky. At that time, Qin Shi had not recovered from his injuries and needed to burn his blood essence to fight with him. But the consequence of burning his blood essence was, he did not control his strength, so Changli ended up without a corpse. Qin Shi had already said so much. No matter how slow Qing Wan was, he finally came back to his senses. If Bai Hong had not arrived in time, he was afraid that he would have been fooled by Qin Shi. Therefore, after being stunned for a moment, Qing Wan instantly roared at Qin Shi in anger. Just look at how angry he was. He looked like an enraged beast. He saw Qing Wan step forward fiercely. The long spear in his hand drew a starlight in the air. Then, like a meteor, he shot straight to Qin Shi. After this spear thrust, the long spear burst out a huge burst of qi. Like a high-speed rotating drill. The spiral qi energy blasted towards Qin Shi while also sucking in the nearby air, so that there was a temporary vacuum between the two. It could be said. Of course, the divine general, rushed towards Qin Shi with a great momentum. The qi that overflowed in the process of its advance plowed a huge gully in the thick ice surface. The spear was 13 feet long. The spearhead was slender like a reed leaf. The shaft was like wood but not wood. The entire body was indigo and carved with dragon patterns. The name of this spear was Starlight. Bai Hong, who was at the side, did not stay idle as the long spear struck. The moment Qing Wan pounced, Bai Hong wielded his long sword and started to dance in the air. Strangely, every time he swung his sword, the long sword would leave a white mark in the air. In the blink of an eye, the air around Bai Hong was like glass, with countless scratches. Go. After a total of 108 strokes, Bai Hong suddenly turned the tip of his sword and pointed it directly at Qin Shi. Then, these scratches seemed to have received some kind of response and suddenly shot towards Qin Shi. A long spear as fast as a dragon, 100 long swords as swift as rain. Facing the two aggressive attacks, Qin Shi's lips suddenly curled into a smile. Then, under Bai Hong's slightly surprised gaze, the divine sword Dharma in Qin Shi's hand suddenly turned into spots of starlight and drifted away. This is giving up on resisting? Even with Bai Hong's intelligence, after seeing Qin Shi's strange behavior, he could not react in time. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. The long spear came crashing down. But just as the long spear was about to pierce Qin Shi's figure suddenly disappeared from Qing Wan's eyes. Impossible. Qing Wan's eyelids twitched, and he immediately wanted to withdraw his long spear. But this spear was used with all his strength. How could it be so easy to withdraw? Qing Wan was like a bull that lost control, and instantly rushed to the position where Qin Shi was just at. But then, the scene in front of him completely changed. He was clearly still on the ice surface condensed by Shui Xiang. But in the blink of an eye, how did he come to a sea of fire? Qing Wan held the long spear in his hand and looked around. It was all a sea of magma. The high temperature constantly evaporated the moisture in the air. After Qing Wan held the long spear and looked around, he suddenly found that there was not even a bit of spiritual energy in this place. What exactly is this place? Qing Wan was a little surprised, but at this moment, the magma below suddenly boiled. Then, a fire qilin suddenly jumped out of the magma, then stomped on the ground with its back foot and bent its front foot slightly, and fiercely roared at Qing Wan. Roar! If Nian Nian was here, she would probably tilt her head and murmur in confusion. Papa, this big cat looks like a big cat. While Qing Wan was in trouble, Bai Hong was also in a bad situation. Because he did not move randomly, Bai Hong did not directly fall into the array set up by Chen Shi in advance like Qing Yuan. But it was precisely because he did not fall into the array that Bai Hong now needed to face Chen Shi directly. And when he really faced Chen Shi, Bai Hong finally understood what was called pressure. Just by standing there, this mysterious man made him feel an enormous pressure that was as heavy as a mountain, and as deep as an abyss. Could it be, Ming Yao's 4 sons were destined to die under this person's sword today? Bai Hong held the long sword in his hand. His hair and beard were all standing up, and he was ready for battle. But while he was on guard, Chen Shi suddenly laughed. Wait a minute, there are mosquitoes. After that, Chen Shi pointed his sword to the sky. A green sword light suddenly burst out, instantly rushed into the clouds, and then directly hit the United States reconnaissance plane that had been hovering in the cumulonimbus layer. Boom. Hearing the sudden explosion in the sky, Bai Hong's eyes flashed with a hint of hesitation. But after hesitating for a while, he still held the long sword in front of his chest, and then said to Chen Shi seriously, "My name is Bai Hong, and my sword name is Flowing Cloud. Please enlighten me." After his voice fell, Bai Hong's entire aura changed. If Bai Hong was more like a noble son who walked out of a painting just now, then now he was completely an unsheathed sword, exuding a sharp sword intent all over his body. Where the Tao exists, even if there are thousands of people, I will go forward. Chapter 291. I have a sword that can cut through people's hearts and ghosts. I have a heart that laughs on the road to immortality. The so-called swordsman did not cultivate the sword, but the heart. Since he held a 3-foot sword, he should be as upright as a sword, as unbreakable as a sword, as sharp as a sword. Only the sword, only the heart, only the self. Therefore, when Bai Hong held the flowing cloud sword and calmly reported his name to Chen Shi, his entire temperament changed completely, like a sharp sword out of its scabbard. Shiny, clear, and sharp. Invisible sword intent gushed out from Bai Hong's body, like a tornado that suddenly rose, expanding outwards with his position as the center. In an instant, small scratches appeared on the surface of the ice, as if someone had used a knife to scrape the surface of the ice. Seeing this, Chen Shi could not help but smile. From Bai Hong's performance just now, he had indeed touched the true essence of the sword. But unfortunately, Bai Hong had only reached the level of intent, and had not really stepped into the level of heart. If one had to use simple words to summarize, it would be, "Benefactor, you're thinking too much." The sword was just a weapon. As long as there was a sword in the heart, even if there was only a branch or a leaf in the hand, why couldn't it be a sword? When a swordsman no longer stopped at the surface, even if there was nothing in the hand, as long as the palm was straight, the palm could be a sword. The sword was not just a weapon. Of course, this kind of pure concept had nothing to do with cultivation, and could only be used to see if a person had the talent to learn the sword. Confucius said, "Those who are born with knowledge are superior, those who learn to know are inferior." Chen Shi had seen a real genius in the way of the sword. He learned the sword at the age of 5, and had already understood the swordless realm at the age of no doubts. In comparison, Chen Shi, who took 500 years to understand the heart sword, was obviously not a peerless genius. Chen Shi did not seem to take Bai Hong seriously at all. When the term sword cultivator appeared in his mind, his thoughts couldn't help but drift further and further away. He even stood there in a daze. Bai Hong saw that Chen Shi did not respond, so she once again performed a sword salute, and then said with a solemn expression, "Please enlighten me." Towards this mysterious man who had defeated Chang Li and Shui Xiang one after another, Bai Hong clearly had to be 120% alert. The word Mr. clearly expressed his feelings at this moment. In this battle, he couldn't escape and he couldn't. The only way was to fight. Bai Hong's fighting spirit was overflowing, and the surging sword intent was like a basin of cold water suddenly poured on Chen Shi's head, making Chen Shi suddenly come back to his senses. "I'm sorry, I got distracted. I don't dare to teach you anything. You can use your sword. I want to see your moves first. Maybe I can get some inspiration from it." Chen Shi smiled apologetically at Bai Hong. His tone was very casual, as if he was chatting with a friend. Hearing this, Bai Hong's expression was very serious. After bowing to Chunxi again, Bai Hong pulled out a sword flower and shouted loudly, "If that's the case, then I'll offend you." As the voice fell, Bai Hong's figure suddenly flew into the air. As Bai Hong pointed the long sword in his hand, the long sword suddenly burst out in extremely dazzling light. Immediately after, a huge shadow of a divine sword faintly appeared around Bai Hong, and he himself was in the position of the sword hilt. This move is called hitting water. Please enlighten me, Mr. Transforming feather hanging sky, tugging wind 90,000 shaking scales across the sea, hitting water 3,000. The first move of the Fuyao sword technique, hitting water. The huge sword shadow crashed down with a bang. At this time, Chunxi held the divine sword Dharma form in his hand, and once again slashed out a green sword light. Perhaps it was because it was too hasty, but the cyan sword light seemed too small compared to the sword shadow formed by the white rainbow. As soon as they touched, the green sword light was completely swallowed by the white sword shadow. Without any obstruction, the white sword shadow crashed down. Boom! Like an intercontinental missile hitting its target, the surging true origin immediately caused a violent explosion on the ice surface. One had to know that because of the extreme cold in the water, the layer of ice that condensed on the surface of the sea was at least 10 meters thick. When the sword came down, it actually shattered the endless layer of ice into pieces. How was this still a missile? It was simply a comet hitting the earth. In an instant, the waves rolled and roared. The huge force caused the water below to spurt up to a height of nearly 100 meters. Looking down from the sky, one could see that the position where Chunxi was just at was the center of the explosion. The 100-meter-tall wave continued to spread out in a circular shape, wave after wave, and did not calm down for a long time. It could be said that it really lived up to the name of this move. Hitting water. Kuan Peng hitting water 3,000 miles. Bai Hong's move caused the surface of the sea to drop by nearly 100 meters. However, the sea had to calm down in the end. When the waves that were smashed by him gradually flowed back, Bai Hong frowned and flew out of the sea. Something was wrong. Just now he had clearly locked onto that person's chi. And that person had not dodged, so this sword must have hit him. Then where was he? Bai Hong flew in the air and looked around, but he did not even see a shadow of a person. Could it be that that person was just a facade, and under his full strength attack, he was turned into powder on the spot, and even his corpse could not be found? How could it be? Bai Hong frowned and looked around, but he did not detect any signs of spirit chi fluctuations. But at this moment, a crisp sound of palms came from not far behind him. Pa pa pa. Very good, accumulating strength and attacking with full strength. It is indeed worthy of my reference. But there is also a flaw, and that is that this move is actually not suitable as the first move of this sword technique, especially when the opponent's strength is on par with yours, or even slightly stronger than yours. This flaw will become particularly prominent. I don't know if you have heard of this saying. The fist is 30%, the leg is 70%. The fist is 30% of the strength, and the sword is agile, so naturally it is the same, so this move can only be used later, and is not suitable to be used at the beginning of the fight. Also, let me say one more thing. Such a wide open move is obviously more suitable for your spear user friend. Am I right? Bai Hong looked back, only to see Chunxi appear behind him, unscathed. Looking at his relaxed and calm face, Bai Hong felt the pressure in his heart increase, and he almost had a feeling of suffocation. This person, is he a human or a ghost? What realm is he in? Why does he give me a completely unfathomable feeling? How is this possible? Bai Hong's expression was a little uncertain. At this moment, Chunxi suddenly smiled and said, "Oh right. That friend of yours who turned into ice was accidentally sent flying by you. Do you want me to bring you to look for him?" Hearing Chunxi's slightly joking words, Bai Hong felt even more pressure in his heart. But at this moment he seemed to have thought of something, and could not help but mumble softly, "Friend?" Following closely, Bai Hong seemed to have finally understood something, and fiercely withdrew his long sword, then said to Chunxi with a serious face, "So I have been under your control from the beginning to the end. Sir, you are indeed very capable." Chapter 292. I've learned my lesson. After saying that, Bai Hong acted out of character, and the corner of his mouth couldn't help but curl up into a faint smile. This kind of calm and relaxed performance was a world of difference from the solemnity he showed before. Then Bai Hong slowly withdrew his long sword under Chen Shi's gaze, and then sat cross-legged in the air calmly. Looking at that posture, it seemed that he didn't want to fight anymore. Seeing this, the smile on Chen Shi's face couldn't help but shrink a little. After seriously sizing up Bai Hong, Chen Shi could only praise from the bottom of his heart. "You're indeed very smart, at least much smarter than your 3 companions. Sir, you flatter me." Bai Hong smiled slightly, looking like he had a card up his sleeve. It seemed that he had completely seen through Chen Shi's little trick. In fact, from the time when Shuixiang froze itself to the time when Bai Hong and Qing Wan arrived, Chen Shi was not idle at all. Using the ice that froze Shuixiang as the formation door, and using the gate of heaven that constantly devoured the surrounding spirit energy as the formation core, Chen Shi cleverly used the materials on the spot, so he quickly set up a large-scale formation that seized the fortune of heaven and earth. Mind Confusion Array. Due to the limited conditions, this formation was mainly focused on trapping and disturbing. It did not have any offensive ability, and it could only be effective on enemies whose cultivation level was lower than the one who set up the formation. Looking at the current situation, this formation did indeed allow Chen Shi to achieve his goal. But it was a pity, however, Bai Hong was much more intelligent than he had imagined. Just by the word friend that Chen Shi casually mentioned, Bai Hong was actually very sensitive to the fact that he might have fallen into Chen Shi's trap. If he didn't break the formation, then Bai Hong would not be able to hurt Chen Shi at all even if he exhausted all his strength. Because everything he saw now was an illusion. The reason why Chen Shi had been using words to pressure Bai Hong was purely because he wanted to use them to break down Bai Hong's psychological barrier, so that Bai Hong would fall deeper and deeper, treating the illusion as real and wasting her true essence in the array formation for nothing. Once their Zhen Yuan was exhausted, Chen Shi would be able to effortlessly take down the 3 of them in one fell swoop. Unfortunately, Bai Hong was not a reckless person like Qing Wan. The feeling of being trapped in an illusion array was actually not much different from a dream. No matter how bizarre the dream was, the dreamer would not easily realize that they were just dreaming. Just like how Bai Hong didn't think about why Qing Wan disappeared from her side just now. Therefore, only when the dreamer realized that they were dreaming would they be able to wake up from the dream. Thinking of this, Bai Hong emptied her mind and entered a meditative state. As expected, when he opened his eyes again, the scene in front of him had completely changed. The ice block that froze Shuixiang was floating on the surface of the sea, and Qing Wan seemed to treat the ice block as an enemy, continuously launching wave after wave of fierce attacks at the ice block. Looking at the small cracks that kept appearing on the ice block under the attack of Qing Wan, Bai Hong frowned. If he didn't guess wrongly, his water strike earlier should have hit the ice as well? The man in front of him actually wanted to use the 2 of them to break the ice barrier of Shuixiang. Killing 3 birds with 1 stone? How vicious and meticulous was this? The expression on Bai Hong's face was a little uncertain. Chen Shi's despicable behavior really hurt his nerves. But the strange thing was Bai Hong did not immediately flare up. After taking a deep breath, Bai Hong held the long sword in his hand tightly, and said word by word to the real Chen Shi in front of him. "Since Mister's strength is far superior to us, why don't you dare to have a fair fight with us?" Hearing this, Chen Shi couldn't help but laugh a few times. Although his method was indeed a bit disgraceful, it saved him a lot of trouble. Chen Shi's head was not made of iron. Since he could easily outsmart them, why should he force himself to fight with these 2 people? Do they really think he's made of iron? Moreover, this kind of behavior was actually very common in the Tianxian sector. It was just that Chen Shi had always prided himself as an outstanding young man in the new century, so when his little trick was exposed by Bai Hong, he couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. He always felt that he was like Demon King Kuba in Super Mario, and Bai Hong and Qing Wan were Super Mario brothers. The 2 brothers represented the righteous side and bravely fought against the evil Demon King Kuba in order to save Princess Shuixiang. Ashamed, Bai Hong waited for a while. Seeing that Chen Shi had been silent, he suddenly changed the topic and asked with a bit of probing. "I think, Mister, you have to keep us here today? Yes. At this point, Qinshi didn't hide anymore and simply nodded straightforwardly. Hearing this, Bai Hong asked in confusion, "May I ask, mister, what kind of deep grudge do you have with us? Why do you have to kill us all?" Hearing this, Qinshi couldn't help but be stunned. This guy's tone. Why does it sound a little strange? Aren't Chongli and Shui Xiang his companions? Qinshi first killed Chongli, then injured Shui Xiang. But judging from Bai Hong's reaction now, these two people didn't seem to have as high a position in his heart as Qinshi thought. Qinshi was a little confused, so he didn't immediately reply. Seeing this, Bai Hong continued to say, "I think Mr. also knows that it's not easy for us to cultivate to this point. So if I may be so bold, mister, let us live." This guy was rather straightforward. Seeing that he couldn't beat Qinshi and couldn't escape, he actually directly begged for mercy. In the end, it was because there wasn't any irreconcilable hatred between them. From the moment he escaped from the formation, Bai Hong realized that he was no match for this mysterious man in front of him. Knowing that he couldn't win but still fighting with his life, this was definitely not a decision that a smart person would make. After all, death was the end of all troubles. Only by living would there be hope for the future. For an immortal cultivator like Bai Hong, who was more rational than emotional, this was indeed a very simple choice. This time, it was Qinshi's turn to have a headache. After all, he wasn't some cold-blooded demon king. Since Bai Hong had lowered his head and admitted defeat, then, should he kill him or not? Qinshi seriously considered this question. Perhaps it was because he had been in normal society for a long time. The current Qinshi was obviously more humane than when he was in Heavenly Spiral. But there was an old saying, letting the tiger return to the mountain would cause endless trouble in the future. Therefore, after some serious consideration, Qinshi came up with a compromise. "How about this? If you can take one move from me, then I promise to let you live. How about it?" As soon as he said this, Bai Hong couldn't help but smile. He hurriedly replied, "If that's the case, please enlighten me, mister." It was the same as before. However, Bai Hong clearly didn't understand what Qinshi meant by one move. Until Chapter 293. The saber was just a very ordinary saber. The only thing that was surprising was that this saber was condensed from the Dharma form. Bai Hong originally thought that this mysterious man was also a sword cultivator, but he didn't expect that he would suddenly conjure a saber. Left hand holding a saber, right hand holding a sword. Because of the difference in level, Bai Hong had always been unable to accurately detect the fluctuation of spirit energy on Qinshi's body. Until the appearance of this saber, Bai Hong finally noticed that there was a strong fluctuation of spirit energy on Qinshi's body. Just the movement of spirit chi before charging up for a move gave Bai Hong a very strange feeling all of a sudden. Like a lonely traveler who came to the end of the world, looking at the sea and the starry sky. And Qinshi was the sea, the starry sky. As vast as the sea, as deep as the starry sky. The moment the long saber appeared in Qinshi's hand, the calm sea suddenly blew up like a typhoon. The spirit energy between heaven and earth seemed to be guided, and rushed towards Qinshi's position. In an instant, surging, raging. Seeing this, Bai Hong couldn't help but change color, and hurriedly used the long sword in his hand to draw a sword flower, trying to calm himself down. This mysterious man had already promised him that as long as he could withstand this move, he would let the three of them live. Thinking about it, with the other party's strength, it should be impossible for him to go back on his word. Therefore, Bai Hong immediately braced himself and waited, gathering all the vital essence in his body into his dantian, preparing to use his trump card to receive the other party's earth-shattering move. Although his strength was definitely not as good as the other party, Bai Hong still felt that it was impossible that he couldn't even withstand one move from the other party, right? Thinking of this, Bai Hong couldn't help but look at the long sword in his hand, and a trace of bitterness appeared on his face. The blade was still shiny and sharp, but Bai Hong didn't notice it in his heart. He no longer had the indomitable momentum of a sword cultivator, because he was afraid. Fear before the battle, this was a big taboo. And just as Bai Hong was feeling uneasy, Qinshi's voice suddenly sounded. "Your heart is in a mess. Do you want to have some time to adjust?" Hearing this, Bai Hong could not help but be stunned. After taking a deep look at Qinshi, Bai Hong shook her head and said to Qinshi seriously, "No need, thank you for your advice." After saying that, Bai Hong gently exhaled a mouthful of turbid air. Then, under Qinshi's slightly surprised gaze, she fiercely slashed her left hand on the sword. Blood immediately dyed the long sword red. However, the white rainbow seemed to be unaware of it. She raised her sword horizontally and recited word by word to Qinshi. This move is called sun piercing. It is derived from the meaning of the white rainbow piercing the sun. There is only one move, please enlighten me. The comet attacks the moon, and the white rainbow pierces the sun. Anger has yet to be unleashed, but a truce has fallen from the heavens. If the warrior is enraged, 2 corpses will fall. 5 steps of blood. The world is in mourning. An extremely powerful aura suddenly erupted from Bai Hong's body. Even when facing Qinshi, who was wielding both sword and saber, she was not at a disadvantage at all. Seeing this, Qinshi could not help but nod in satisfaction. One must know that when Changli had faced the sword and saber dual mastery, his performance was not even as good as Bai Hong's today. The more intelligent a person was, the more afraid they were of death. However, Bai Hong was able to withstand this kind of pressure. She even managed to break through herself and forcibly bring out her peak state. Just based on this point alone, 10 Changlis could not compare to her. Qinshi knew that cultivation was not easy, so he had always cherished talents. But regrettably, in order to give Nianyan and Yingying a stable environment, he had no choice but to keep Bai Hong and her party here today. He could not let them return to the Divine Gate. Come, as long as you can withstand this move of mine, I will let you go. After taking a deep look at Bai Hong, Qinshi finally raised the sword and saber in his hand. This was also the most powerful set of techniques that he had learned in his life, sword and saber. The second move, sword splitting light, sword vanishing shadow, desolate killing, chaotic mortal world. As soon as the chaotic mortal world was released, Qinshi suddenly opened his arms and let the sword and saber in his hand fly out, circling in the air. Using qi to control the sword. Using spirit to control the sword. The sword and saber flew faster and faster, leaving behind afterimages in the air. It was as if there were countless swords and sabers in the sky. At this time, Bai Hong felt that there seemed to be an incomparably sorrowful and desolate aura between heaven and earth. If he closed his eyes and carefully felt it, it would give him the illusion that he was on a battlefield. A vast battlefield after a great battle. There was no living person, only endless desolation, and the heavy coldness that death brought. This move could actually affect the minds of others? Thinking of this, Bai Hong could not help but shiver. However, he did not retreat at all. Instead, he gripped the sword in his hand tightly, and suddenly turned into a ray of white light, charging straight at Qinshi. There were no fancy moves. 1 man and 1 sword was enough. Even if there were thousands of people, he would still go. This was the white rainbow piercing the sun. The moment Bai Hong rushed out with the sword, Qinshi seemed to have noticed something, so he fiercely clasped his hands in front of his chest. Then, the thousands of swords dancing in the sky seemed to have received some kind of instruction. They suddenly gathered in front of him, and then spiraled into a sphere. The sphere carried a desolate and desperate aura, like the broken swords and sabers on the battlefield. Even if they were broken, they would still shatter everything in the world. The sphere formed by the sword and saber collided head-on with the ray of white light. The moment the two collided, the whole scene seemed to be frozen. Immediately after, an extremely violent explosion occurred. Boom! With the point of collision as the center, invisible energy waves continued to spread outwards wildly. In an instant, the wind and clouds surged and the sea waves surged. Like an atomic bomb exploding, the huge explosion made the sea water soar into the sky. Looking at the center of the explosion, one could see the colorful seaweed on the seabed. Even the sea was blown up. The power of one blow was so terrifying. Tons of seawater were blown into the air, and then turned into a torrent, pouring down from the sky. The crashing sound of the waves lasted for a full 5 minutes, and the vast Pacific Ocean finally returned to its previous state. Although the sea was calm, Qinshi's heart did not calm down for a long time. He floated in the sky, and the sword and saber in his hand had already dissipated. Sigh. After letting out a soft sigh, Qinshi raised his head and looked forward. Bai Hong was not far away, but his white cloak had already become rags, and it was stained with blood, like a rag doll that had just been fished out of a red vat. Blood kept coming out of Bai Hong's body, and then slid down his skin to the soles of his feet, and finally dripped into the sea drop by drop. Who would have thought that the bloody man in front of him, who looked like he had been executed by 1,000 cuts, was actually Bai Hong, who was said to be as beautiful as jade, as unparalleled in the world. Sir, good skill, Bai Hong. I've learned. Bai Hong opened his mouth with great difficulty. After saying these words in a voice as soft as a mosquito, he seemed to have lost all strength and fell limply from the sky. Splash. Scarlet blood dyed the sea red. Qinshi lowered his head and looked at the bubbles mixed with blood coming out of the sea. He could not help but let out a soft sigh again. Chapter 294. Tonight was destined to be a sleepless night. The strong light was still suspended in midair, like the sun constantly emitting dazzling rays of light, trying to illuminate everything around it. Qinshi sat cross-legged in the air, only 2 to 3 meters above the sea surface, looking thoughtfully at the 2 spoils of war in his hands. One was Bai Hong's long sword, the other was naturally Qinghuan's long spear. The sword was named Flowing Cloud, and the spear was named Pointing Stars. The quality of the 2 weapons was not bad. Even in Qinshi's eyes, they could barely be regarded as 2 offensive magic weapons. The so-called magic weapons were naturally treasures used by immortal cultivators, and usually had some kind of magical effect. For example, the azure wave silk gauze in Shui Xiang's hands, although it looked like a simple shawl, it had both offensive and defensive functions. When Shui Xiang was sneak attacked by Qinshi, this long silk immediately turned into a defensive tool, protecting the seriously injured Shui Xiang, which also gave her another means of self-protection. Magic weapons were also divided into grades. According to their quality, they were divided by immortal cultivators into magic weapons, spirit treasures, supreme treasures, and the extremely rare innate supreme treasures. Most magic weapons were refined by immortal cultivators themselves, just like forging swords. The craftsmanship of the craftsman and the materials used to forge the sword would affect the quality of the finished product. One had to know that the cultivation environment on Earth was so bad, it was naturally impossible to produce any high-quality magic weapon materials. Even the cleverest housewife couldn't cook without rice, without even the materials. Qinshi couldn't make magic weapons out of thin air, right? Therefore, he could at most refine some simple magic weapons. Just like the pendant that he gave to Aunt Zhang before, it could help her block some dangers such as car accidents, flower pots falling from the sky, and other unlucky things. But if Aunt Zhang encountered a bomb attack, the power of the explosion exceeded the pendant's tolerance limit, and the pendant would naturally lose its effect. Therefore, these 2 spoils of war were actually very valuable in Qinshi's eyes. As long as they were broken down and recast, he could use these materials to create a suitable defensive magic weapon for Niannian. Although with Huaxia's public security, it was impossible for a terrorist incident like a bomb attack to happen. But it was better to be safe than sorry. Niannian was his treasure. If she was accidentally hurt, Qinshi would never forgive himself. Therefore, Qinshi weighed the spoils in his hand and kept thinking about what kind of magic weapon he should forge for the little guy. Longevity lock? He was a child after all, so it was naturally best for him to wear a longevity lock. However, children nowadays matured early, especially girls. After a few years, would Niannian find the longevity lock ugly and refuse to wear it anymore? Qinshi was a little conflicted. He was afraid that Niannian would not like it and throw it away. Why not make a jade bracelet? Or bracelets, anklets, and other accessories? As a father, he was constantly conflicted about how to please his daughter. But right at that moment, suddenly, an extremely strong fluctuation of spirit qi appeared in the strong light above his head. Qinshi sensed something was wrong, so he quickly looked up. After looking at it for a while, he suddenly frowned. Something was wrong. Since this strong light was the so-called heavenly gate, then the current situation was somewhat like. He was watching television at home when a faint noise suddenly came from outside the door. Although the noise was small, it was enough to attract his attention. Therefore, Chunshi immediately closed his eyes and carefully sensed for a while before finally confirming. There was someone behind the door. That person kept pacing back and forth outside the door, as if he wanted to cross the door very much, but for some reason he was hesitating. It felt like a thief was checking if there was anyone in the house. Chunshi did not want to expose himself, so he immediately restrained his aura and silently looked up at the strong light. At the same time, he held Baihong's flowing cloud sword tightly in his hand. The heavenly gate was a magical existence similar to a teleportation array. The inside and outside of the gate were connected to two completely different worlds. Although that person was outside the door, he could still affect the fluctuation of spirit chi inside the gate. What kind of terrifying cultivation was this? Relying on the fluctuation of spirit chi, Chunshi secretly tried to figure out the other party's cultivation level. And the person outside the door seemed to be worried about something. So after pacing back and forth for a long time, he still did not cross the door. Chunshi waited patiently. About 5 minutes later, a sudden change occurred. The strong light suddenly burst into a burst of extremely dazzling light. Chunshi's expression turned cold. He immediately raised the long sword in his hand, ready to make the first move and catch the other party off guard. But at this time, the strong light suddenly flashed a few times, and then disappeared in an instant, as if there was a power outage. Without a light source, the world suddenly darkened. Thick dark clouds covered the moonlight, to the extent that one could not see his fingers in front of him. Even Chunshi could not see his surroundings clearly. Chunshi lit up a ball of light. Under his control, the ball of light slowly flew to the place where the strong light was before. But there was nothing left. Even the spirit chi that had been crazily rushing to the place where the strong light was now like a water ball that had been pierced. The spirit chi of heaven and earth that had lost its restraints suddenly dissipated in all directions crazily. In just a few breaths of time, everything had returned to normal. As if nothing had happened. Only the sound of the waves was left between heaven and earth. Whoosh! Whoosh! The waves slowly surged into the distance, one after another. Chunshi let out a long sigh of relief, finally letting go of his worries. With the closing of the divine gate, this matter could be considered to have come to an end for the time being. Now he only needed to clean up the mess and erase the traces that he had left behind. Then, even if the divine gate appeared again in the future, it would have nothing to do with him. Chunshi stood up and looked around. After confirming that there were no problems here, he was ready to leave. But at this time, he seemed to have noticed something and hurriedly looked up at the sky in the distance. Because the strong light disappeared, Chunshi couldn't see very clearly. It wasn't until a black shadow rushed out of the clouds that Chunshi finally saw the thing clearly with the light emitted by the ball of light. It was actually the trump card of the United States, the B-2 stealth bomber. The B-2 was known as the world's most advanced strategic bomber, with a cost of up to $2.4 billion. According to the United States Department of Defense, every time the B-2 was deployed, it would cost at least $3 million. Therefore, the moment he saw this guy appear, Chunshi suddenly understood something. This group of United States people, they were really as annoying as flies. Sure enough, when the B-2 flew over Chunshi's head, it suddenly opened the hatch and threw out 2 long objects. Chunshi looked up at the 2 objects thrown out by the B-2 and suddenly couldn't help but show a dumbfounded expression on his face. Just now, he was bullying Shui Xiang for being uneducated, and asked if she could withstand a nuclear bomb. This is retribution is here. Chapter 295. The B-2 was known as a stealth fighter, but it actually meant that it could avoid radar detection, not that it was actually invisible. Chunshi frowned and looked at the things thrown out by the B-2. He didn't need to think about it before he concluded that the 2 things must be nuclear bombs. It was not that he knew about nuclear bombs, but because as an Earthling, Chunshi was very clear about the morality of the United States. The United States, the world's recognized superpower, the world's overlord, and the Pacific Police. They drove nuclear-powered aircraft carriers all day long, and naturally did not put any country or force in their eyes. Tonight's phenomenon appeared in international waters, and international waters had always been regarded as their backyard by the United States, so they wanted to join in the fun. There was nothing wrong with joining in the fun, but the mistake of the United States was they didn't even understand the situation, and they dared to directly fire at Shui Xiang. The consequences of doing so were imaginable. Under Shui Xiang's angry attack, a destroyer was gone, and an elite team equipped with exoskeleton armor was also gone. In terms of monetary value, the value of an exoskeleton armor was comparable to that of a destroyer, let alone a full combat squad. The Americans were infuriated by such a heavy loss, so they sent out another reconnaissance aircraft to investigate the situation. But just as the plane arrived, it was struck down by Chen Shi's sword. The successive attacks finally exhausted the last trace of patience of the United States. Since they couldn't get it, they would destroy it. Just like Mahang 370 back then. Simple and violent. The B-2's flying speed was very fast. After dropping the nuclear bomb, it turned around and was ready to leave. Seeing this, Chen Shi couldn't help but sneer. Then he waved the long sword in his hand toward the sky. Just like a charged weapon in a sci-fi movie, the long metal sword suddenly burst out with a dazzling light. Immediately after, a white light shot out from the tip of the sword. The white light cut through the night sky. An explosion suddenly sounded in the sky. Boom! In the blink of an eye, the B-2 had turned into a fireball and fell straight from the sky. That scene really had a different kind of beauty. Just as Chen Shi hit the B-2, the two nuclear bombs had already landed not far above Chen Shi. Seeing this, Chen Shi suddenly raised his right hand towards the two nuclear bombs. It was like a traffic police officer making a stop sign. As soon as this gesture was made, the two nuclear bombs seemed to have been hit by a pause button and strangely stopped in midair. The two nuclear bombs weren't very big, only about 2 meters long. They seemed to be small nuclear bombs. One had to know that nuclear bombs were limited by their critical mass. It was usually easy to make a large one, but difficult to make a small one. Therefore, in the entire world, only the United States could produce a small nuclear bomb of this size. Chen Shi thought for a moment, then tried to use his spiritual ether to destroy all the internal circuits of a nuclear bomb, completely turning it into scrap metal. As a highly educated person in modern society, Chen Shi was well aware of the value of this thing. Therefore, he was prepared to give this nuclear bomb to the country as a form of repayment to his country. As for the other one, of course, give it back to someone else. After all, it was a traditional virtue of the Chinese people to return the money they found. Thinking of this, Chen Shi used his spiritual ether to bind the two nuclear bombs, then quickly flew in the direction of the Okinawa Islands. The Okinawa Islands were known as the Ryukyu Islands in ancient times. Taiwan's ancient name was Ryukyu. Because of various historical reasons, the Okinawa Islands were now under the jurisdiction of Japan. This location was very special. It was only 600 kilometers away from the bay, and 400 kilometers away from the Diaoyu Islands. Since the end of World War II, the United States had established a military base in the Okinawa Islands and regarded it as an important cornerstone of the Pacific Rim strategic plan. In fact, this military base with 50,000 soldiers had always been a sword of Damocles hanging over Wuxia's head. The United States fighter jets took off from the base and could arrive in Wuxia in less than 20 minutes. Therefore, this place was also called by the United States military the unsinkable aircraft carrier. When Chen Shi flew over the Okinawa military base, the base was as bright as day. Soldiers the size of ants moved back and forth in the base, and many fighter jets were neatly parked on the runway, looking like they were ready to take off at any time. Looking at this situation, the base should be in a state of level 1 combat readiness. Thinking about it, even the nuclear bombs were taken out. Wasn't this a war? Chen Shi originally wanted to throw down the nuclear bombs and leave, but when he saw the densely packed soldiers below, he still hesitated in his heart. Although everyone's skin color was different, they were still fresh lives after all. Maybe it was because he had been with Nian for too long. Chen Shi did indeed respect life more than before. Therefore, after hesitating for a moment, he raised the long sword in his hand and slashed at the runway below. The white sword light shot out from the long sword and became bigger and bigger in the air. When the sword light hit the airport runway below, It instantly left a huge gully like a moat on the runway. Boom! The huge explosion alarmed the entire base. The rapid ear-piercing alarm suddenly sounded, and the soldiers moved one after another, entering a state of combat as quickly as possible. At this moment, Chunxi's deep voice suddenly sounded from the sky. Chunxi's voice accurately reached everyone's ears, as if a god had come down to deliver a decree. I'll give you half an hour to organize a retreat. After half an hour, I'll use a nuclear bomb to destroy this place. I repeat, a nuclear bomb that you won't be able to intercept. So I sincerely advise you to cherish your lives, stay away from war and leave. In order to make these soldiers understand, Chunxi even used English, which she hadn't used in 500 years. It could be said that she was being extremely benevolent. As for whether they would listen or not, this obviously wasn't something Chunxi needed to worry about. Therefore, after throwing out these harsh words, Chunxi sat cross-legged in the sky and silently began the countdown. Half an hour. If they really wanted to retreat, with the reserves of this military base, it was actually a very easy thing to do. But to Chunxi's surprise, the soldiers in the base didn't have the slightest intention of evacuating. Instead, they entered a state of combat. In an instant, dozens of combat aircraft flew out of the base. At the same time, many air defense equipment hidden underground were also activated, ready to launch at any time. Perhaps because the United States was confident in intercepting any nuclear attack, Chunxi waited for half an hour and didn't see anyone leaving the base, so he could only helplessly sigh. There's a path to heaven, but you don't want to take it, and there's no door to hell, sigh. Chunxi didn't want to see the hellish scene, so he wrapped the nuclear bomb with his energy and quietly threw the nuclear bomb at the base. After that, he directly left with the 2 spoils of war and the nuclear bomb. Not long after he left, an earth-shattering explosion rang out as expected. Chapter 296. The aircraft carrier that claimed to be unsinkable sunk. In fact, Chunxi had always been curious about a question, and that was, could he resist the attack of a nuclear bomb with his body? Even a small nuclear bomb had a temperature of at least 50 million degrees Celsius at the center of the explosion. This temperature was actually equivalent to the surface temperature of the sun. The only difference between the two was that the sun could continue to heat up, while a nuclear bomb only had a short burst. However, the short moment of the nuclear bomb explosion was enough to melt all the cement and steel within a kilometer into liquid, and even vaporize it into gas invisible to the naked eye. The shock wave generated by the explosion would destroy all the buildings within a 3-kilometer radius. In addition, there was also radioactive pollution that would last for decades once it was leaked. Nuclear bombs were the crystallization of human wisdom. In terms of social status, they were at least comparable to innate treasures. Therefore, Chunxi was still a little uncertain about whether nuclear bombs could threaten him. After all, he couldn't run to the center of the explosion and use himself as a live experiment in order to verify whether nuclear bombs could hurt him, right? Then wouldn't he be a moron? Chunxi decisively put this problem behind him, and then returned to Zhonghai with another nuclear bomb. When Chunxi returned to Zhonghai, he found that Qin Shui had taken people to block the coastline, and even the estuary of Dianjiang overnight, prohibiting any people or ships from entering Zhonghai. Chunxi flew along the coastline. After finding the temporary command post built by Qin Shui on the beach, he threw the nuclear bomb down in front of Qin Shui's stunned expression. When Qin Shui finally reacted and chased out of the command post in a panic, Chunxi had already disappeared into the horizon. The next morning, when the little guy sat up from the bed with sleepy eyes, Chunxi and Qin Ruoying were sitting on the sofa outside, watching the morning news with relish. Because of the nuclear explosion accident last night, the media all over the world rushed to report it as if they were on steroids. As a result, this news spread all over the world in an instant, so now at least half of the people on Earth were paying attention to this matter. Finally, 2 hours after the accident, the White House spokesperson finally came forward to explain the cause of the nuclear leakage accident at the Okinawa military base. It was said that a certain staff member had made a mistake and caused an explosion in the laboratory, causing a series of chain reactions. First, it detonated the arsenal, Then it set fire to the hangar next to it. In the end, even a nuclear submarine temporarily docked at the port for maintenance was affected, causing the nuclear reactor inside the nuclear submarine to malfunction and explode, leading to such a serious nuclear leak disaster. The Okinawa military base was an important part of the Pacific Rim strategic plan. Even during non-war times, there were at least 20,000 soldiers stationed in the base, but now, less than a tenth of the 20,000 soldiers survived. Even if some were lucky enough to survive, their bodies had been severely contaminated by nuclear radiation. Their future situation was definitely not optimistic. In terms of economics, because it was not a civilian facility, it was estimated that the economic losses caused by this accident were at least $500 billion. This number, it was almost close to the military expenditure of the United States for a whole year. In other words, the seriousness of this accident was no less than the Pearl Harbor incident during World War II. What annoyed the United States the most was, this nuclear bomb originally belonged to them. Throwing a nuclear bomb in the Pacific Ocean was not something that the United States, who had always liked to maintain world peace, would do. Therefore, even if the losses were huge, the United States could only swallow their pride. They had to conceal the truth of the accident and forcibly make up a lie that could not stand up to scrutiny at all. As for what the truth of this matter was, and what kind of undercurrent was surging behind it, it was obviously not something that ordinary people could understand. The little girl sat on the bed and rubbed her eyes with her small hands. Then, like a kitten, she pouted and called out softly, "Mama!" It could be seen that after this period of hard work, Qin Ruiying had successfully occupied a position equal to Chunxi in the little girl's heart. In the little girl's heart, Papa and Mama were finally on the same level. Qin Ruiying was now considered to have succeeded in qi cultivation, and the sensitivity of her 5 senses had been greatly improved. Therefore, after hearing the little girl's cry, she quickly ran into the bedroom and took the little girl to wash up. At this time, Chunxi went to the kitchen and brought out the 8 treasure porridge that he carefully cooked. A plate of delicious shrimp dumplings and a few side dishes. This was the little girl's favorite breakfast now. The couple served the little princess breakfast and accompanied her to recite a few ancient poems. Then they discussed today's itinerary. They had already been to their alma mater and met their classmates and friends. So what should they do next? The couple was now like nouveau riche. They had a lot of money in their pockets. Just the bank interest alone was enough to make them comfortable, so they only needed to eat, drink, and play all day long. They were happy to be social parasites. Therefore, where to take Nian Nian to play became a problem that they needed to struggle with every day. The two of them didn't struggle for long. Qin Ruiying's phone suddenly rang. The caller was Lin Xian. After yesterday's catching up, the revolutionary friendship between the two of them could be said to have been re-established. "Ying, I told Lele the news of your return. She was so happy. So, she asked me to ask you out today. She wants to have a good gathering in our dormitory." "Okay, where is it?" "Let me tell you first, I'm going to bring my husband." Speaking of this, Qin Ruiying very playfully winked at Chunxi. In the past, when their dormitory had dinner together, Chunxi was not qualified to participate. However, now was different. Her boyfriend had already become her husband. Naturally, Qin Ruiying would bring Chunxi. After hearing Qin Ruiying's words, Lin Xian on the other end of the phone did not immediately reply. She was silent for a while on the other end of the phone. Then, she coughed lightly and pretended to be calm as she replied, "Okay, don't show off your affection in front of me. You haven't met Lele's fiancé yet, right? Let her introduce him to you tonight. You have sharp eyes, so you have to help her interrogate him. Anyway, they haven't registered their marriage yet. It's not too late for Lele to back out now." Tui, what are you saying? Since they're already engaged, it must be true love, right? What's there to interrogate? I can't say too much about other people's matters. Because they were too close, Qin Ruiying did not shy away from joking over the phone. However, after hearing her words, Lin Xian did not seem to be joking at all. Instead, she said very seriously, "Ying, I'm serious. My woman's intuition tells me that Lele's fiancé is not simple." Oh, hearing this, Qin Ruoying could not help but glance at Chen Shi in confusion. Chen Shi attended Fang Lei's wedding. With his sharp five senses, even without studying psychology, he was very accurate in judging people. Therefore, Qin Ruoying wanted to hear Chen Shi's evaluation of this person. However, at this time, Chen Shi frowned slightly. Speaking of which, what was the name of Fang Lei's fiancé? If he remembered correctly, his name was Wang Shiwu? But why did this person not leave a deep impression on him? After all, Chen Shi now had the ability to remember everything he saw. Therefore, he was very sure that this person had not appeared in front of him more than a few times. Chapter 297. The dormitory gathering that had been away for many years was set at 7 o'clock tonight, and the dining location was chosen by Fang Lei at a well-known high-end restaurant in Zhonghai. Lin Xian disliked her for being extravagant and wasteful, but she didn't expect to be choked back by Fang Lei's words. Everyone had graduated for so many years, they couldn't still go to a street food stall for the gathering, right? Lin Xian couldn't refute. Listening to Fang Lei's proud laughter on the phone, Lin Xian simply decided on the theme of tonight's gathering. Tonight's theme was Eat the Rich. The gathering didn't start until the evening, so the couple watched cartoons with the little guy at home all day. It wasn't until 4 o'clock in the afternoon that the family of three finally went out. When Chen Shi walked out of the building with the little guy in his arms, the little guy was instantly stunned by the scene in front of him. He opened his small mouth and screamed, "Papa! Look! The tree fell. And that one fell too." Because of Chen Shi's meditation mantra last night, the little guy was in a deep sleep and didn't know what was going on outside. Last night's natural phenomenon made the people of Zhonghai experience the helplessness of a disaster. In the face of the wrath of nature, human beings were still too small. For Zhonghai, a place with good feng shui, earthquakes and tsunamis were big events that were enough to be recorded in history. Compared to the Okinawa nuclear accident that was far away, the natural disasters that the people of Zhonghai experienced were obviously more likely to attract social attention. Therefore, today's WeChat moments were basically occupied by the words earthquake, rainstorm, tsunami, and other words. All kinds of short videos about last night also rushed to the top of the trending list. Even those who were not in Zhonghai had a rough idea of how terrible last night was. Although the news had reported that the earthquake didn't cause any casualties, it still left a big shadow on everyone. For example, the trees that were blown down by the wind on the roadside gave people a feeling of lingering fear. Kongju residential area was an old residential area, so after the rainstorm, the problems in the residential area's drainage system were all exposed. The residential area did not hire a professional property management, so naturally, no one came to clean up the puddles. Therefore, when they left the building, the path was full of puddles. The deepest part was at least 4 to 5 centimeters thick. Chen Shi had no choice but to hold the little fellow in one hand and hold Qin Ruoying in the other. The family of three stepped on the edge of the flower bed and slowly walked out of the community. The little fellow laid on Chen Shi's shoulder and stretched out his head to look at the puddles on the ground. He immediately seemed to have thought of something and hurriedly hugged Chen Shi's neck and acted coquettishly. "Papa, do a magic trick. I want to see you perform a magic trick." The magic trick she was talking about was obviously the magic trick Chen Shi performed when he carried her to Kunming Lake at night. Walking on the water, a lotus blossomed with every step. As long as this kind of inhuman behavior was displayed in front of her once, as long as she saw a similar scene in the future, this little thing would naturally connect the dots. Hearing this, Chen Shi smiled and said to her, "Daddy has already taught Mommy this trick. Let Mommy show you, okay?" "Okay." Seeing that the little fellow nodded her little head like she was pounding garlic, Qin Ruoying could only ask with a dumbfounded expression, "What trick? Why didn't I know that I could perform a magic trick?" "You can. Come on, I'll tell you." Then Chen Shi leaned over to Qin Ruoying's ear and briefly told Qin Ruoying about walking on the water. But when Qin Ruoying heard Chen Shi's words, she put on a speechless expression. Seeing this, Chen Shi gently squeezed his palm. Qin Ruoying said helplessly, "I'm not as capable as you." "Ying, try it. You can do it." After this period of cultivation, Qin Ruoying had successfully stepped into the late stage of qi refining, which was equivalent to a martial artist in the gang realm. It was almost the realm before Qin Xueqing met Qin Shi. However, Qin Ruoying did not have the foundation of martial arts and had never fought with others, so she was not confident in herself. The reason why Qin Shi asked her to perform a magic trick for Nian was to tell her a fact from the side, that was she was no longer an ordinary person. However, Qin Ruoying was obviously not mentally prepared for this. Because Qin Shi did not teach her magic, Qin Ruoying felt that there was nothing special about her except that her physical strength and 5 senses had been greatly improved. Ying, try to push the vital energy to your leg. Just like what is said in the martial arts movies, calm down first, and then sink the qi into your dantian. Yes, that's it. Treat the water as the ground. Don't be afraid, step on it. Qin Shi stood aside with the little fellow in his arms. Then Qin Ruoying slowly stretched out her right leg toward the water under the gaze of the father and daughter. She was wearing a pair of flat shoes today. As soon as the sharp tips of her shoes touched the water, ripples immediately appeared on the water surface. There was no feeling of touching anything. Qin Ruoying looked at Qin Shi with some doubts, but Qin Shi just smiled and nodded to her, motioning her to continue. At this moment, the little fellow was also interested in the strange behavior of the couple, so like a good baby, she sat quietly in Qin Shi's arms, and her big eyes stared motionlessly at Qin Ruoying's toes. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying suddenly laughed, and then directly stepped into the water. Anyway, the water was not deep, almost reaching the back of the shoes. As long as she tiptoed slightly, the water would not soak into her shoes. However, just as Qin Ruoying's left foot stepped into the water, the little fellow's exclamation suddenly sounded. Mama is so amazing. I want to learn it too. Papa, teach me. Teach me. The little fellow clapped and screamed, and excitedly twisted in Qin Shi's arms. Nian, be good. This trick can only be performed when you grow taller. When you are as tall as me, I will teach you, okay? No. After hearing Qin Shi's refusal, the little fellow suddenly pouted and looked unhappy. While the father and daughter were showing off their love, Qin Ruoying was still a little stunned. That feeling was very strange. It was like stepping on a plastic bag full of water. The water in the plastic bag was fluctuating, so her body swayed slightly. Qin Ruoying tried to withdraw her true essence. Sure enough, her body immediately lost its support and fell into the water, splashing a circle of water. It's okay, Ying, you are not familiar with it. Try again. Seeing that she fell into the water, Qin Shi immediately comforted her. However, Qin Ruoying had a thoughtful expression, as if she did not hear at all. Then, in Qin Shi's slightly surprised eyes, she took a step forward by herself, just as described in the Luo Shen Fu. The light body stands like a crane, as if about to fly but not to soar. Walking on the path of pepper, the steps are thin but the fragrance is flowing. Seeing that Qin Ruoying walked on the water so leisurely, Qin Shi could not help but be stunned. This was the first time Ying used her true essence, right? Her comprehension, very good. Just when Qin Shi was about to praise her, Qin Ruoying suddenly said thoughtfully, you said that you can push your true essence to your feet. Can you also push it to your hands? After that, she gently waved her sleeves at the branch beside her. Then, in front of Qin Shi's shocked expression, a weak true yuan directly hit the branch. Crash! Chapter 298. Looking at the branch that had fallen to the ground, Qin Shi was so surprised that he was speechless for a moment. Although Qin Ruoying had been cultivating for a period of time, she was still at the stage of refining the heaven and earth spiritual qi, and diligently accumulating true essence. One must know that Qin Ruoying did not have any foundation in martial arts, so her ability to control qi in the air made Qin Shi very surprised. After all, Qin Shi had not taught Qin Ruoying how to use true essence. Today, because the little fellow was in the mood, Qin Shi thought of letting Qin Ruoying try. He did not expect that Qin Ruoying's perception was so good that she could understand with just a little bit, and could even draw inferences about other things from one example. A falling leaf reveals the autumn of the world. A glimpse of a spot reveals the whole leopard. The so-called cultivation naturally paid attention to aptitude, bone structure, and perception. All three were indispensable. If aptitude and bone structure represented the body, then perception obviously represented the brain. After Chen Shi's observation during this period of time, he found that Qin Ruoying's aptitude and bone structure were very ordinary. If she continued to cultivate according to her current cultivation speed, then Yuanying should be the limit that Qin Ruoying could reach in this lifetime. Maybe it was because she had lost her Yin soul before. Even after Qin Ruoying's 3 souls returned, her cultivation speed did not improve much. Compared to his sister-in-law, it was simply heaven and earth. This also made Chen Shi subconsciously think that was Qin Ruoying's perception as ordinary as her bone structure? Because of this consideration, Chen Shi did not teach Qin Ruoying those seemingly fancy little spells, but let her concentrate on refining qi, and refining qi, using all her time to refine the heaven and earth spiritual qi. As the saying goes, the clumsy bird flies first. As long as he was there, if he wanted to hurt Qin Ruoying, he would have to step over his dead body first. Naturally, there was no need for her to waste time learning any self-defense skills. However, Qin Ruoying's performance today was completely beyond Chen Shi's expectations. This kind of perception, I'm afraid that she can already catch up with me in the past, right? Thinking of this, Chen Shi could not help but look happy, and quickly stretched out his left hand and snapped his fingers. Pa! After a crisp sound, a weak flame jumped out of Chen Shi's fingers. Ying, why don't you try it? Hearing this, before Qin Ruoying could say anything, the little guy in Chen Shi's arms suddenly shouted excitedly, "Fire! Papa can spit fire? Is this a magic trick? I want to learn. I want to learn. Papa, teach me." The little fellow was very excited. However, Chen Shi did not pay attention to her at all. After pinching her little face to signal her to be quiet, Chen Shi told Qin Ruoying the trick of this magic trick. After listening to Chen Shi's explanation, Qin Ruoying thought for a while, and then asked directly, "Fire control magic trick? Is it like this?" As soon as she finished speaking, she followed Chen Shi's example and snapped her fingers. Soon after, a small flame jumped out from between her fingers. She really learned and applied it immediately, without any delay. Ying, I really didn't expect your perception to be so good. Chen Shi praised from the bottom of her heart. Qin Ruoying smiled, and was about to say something when the little fellow in Chen Shi's arms suddenly exploded. Perhaps it was because she had been neglected by her parents, so the little fellow was really unstoppable at this time. They saw, she pursed her little mouth, and bean-sized tears kept pouring out of her eyes like a tap that had been opened, and she kept sobbing. It was as if she had suffered a great grievance. Her tear-stained face was really pitiful. Chen Shi was stunned by the little fellow's sudden crying. He quickly held her in his arms and comforted her softly. After being interrupted by her, the couple suddenly lost their interest, so they quickly walked out of the community, took a taxi, and went straight to the party address sent by Lin Xian. The dining location was set by Feng Lei. With her status, she naturally would not choose a street stall. Therefore, when Chen Shi and his family arrived at the agreed place, the couple was surprised to find that the place was not like a restaurant at all, but more like a vacation villa. Number 1 Mansion. That was the name of the restaurant. The so-called mansion was actually a bungalow on the beach that often appeared in anti-war dramas. This kind of very old building was very common in Zhonghai. In a sense, the mansion in Zhonghai was somewhat similar to the courtyard houses in Shangjing. It had changed from a simple residence to a cultural symbol. Although number 1 mansion was located in the city center, it was on a remote road. On the clean street, pedestrians in 2s and 3s, as well as 2 rows of lush camphor trees, gave people a very peaceful and comfortable feeling. After getting out of the taxi, the little fellow obediently lay in Chen Shi's arms. It was impossible to tell that she had just cried. And the reason why she was so obedient now was entirely because of the lighter in her hand. The little fellow excitedly fiddled with the lighter. Because she pressed the button so quickly, her thumb was a little red. But she did not feel tired at all. Instead, she constantly lit the fire and pressed the lighter non-stop. Looking at the flame that kept coming out of the lighter, the little thing was very happy as it twisted around in Chen Shi's arms. She also knew how to do magic. When he thought of this, he suddenly couldn't help but grin foolishly. In fact, this lighter was something that Chunshi had shamelessly asked for from the taxi driver. There was no sign outside the mansion. Only two people wearing cheongsam stood outside to welcome guests. Qin Ruoying was not sure if she found the right place, so she called Lin Xian. Not long after, Lin Xian came out of the closed door of the mansion. Although they hadn't seen each other for a day, when Lin Xian saw Chunxi's family again, her face still showed a very happy smile. Ying. Chunxi. Here, come in. Lin Xian greeted her. After taking the little fellow from Chunxi's arms into her own arms, she smiled and said to Qin Ruoying, Ying, you're in for a treat tonight. This #1 mansion's reputation in Zhonghai is very good. Lele has to treat today, so don't be polite with her later. You must take advantage of her. As she spoke, Lin Xian led Chunxi's family into the mansion. After all, it was an old building from the Republic of China. Although it was now converted into a restaurant, the restaurant owner deliberately kept some of the common Chinese and Western decorations of that era. It looked very unique. Feng Lei booked a table on the second floor near the balcony. Lin Xian led Chunxi's family to the second floor. Feng Lei saw them at a glance, so she stood up and greeted with a smile. Ying, long time no see. Feng Lei's personality was somewhat similar to Qin Ruoying's. They were the kind of people who didn't show their emotions easily, so this simple greeting contained a lot of emotions. If the relationship between Qin Ruoying and Lin Xian was warm, then the relationship between her and Feng Lei was indifferent. Just as the old saying goes, the friendship between gentlemen is as indifferent as water. This indifference didn't mean indifference, but it meant purity and purity. The two of them held hands and chatted softly for a while before Qin Ruoying shifted her gaze to the man beside Feng Lei. Lele, this is? Let me introduce, this is my fiancé, Wang Xiwu. Hearing Feng Lei's introduction, Wang Xiwu stretched out his right hand and said with a smile, Miss Qin, nice to meet you. I used to hear your name from Lele, and now I've finally met you in person. You're much more beautiful than I expected. Thank you. Qin Ruoying nodded. When she was about to shake hands with Wang Xiwu, Chunxi suddenly appeared from the side. Then, under the slightly surprised gaze of Feng Lei and Qin Ruoying, he directly shook Wang Xiwu's hand. Chapter 299. Seeing Chunxi emerge from the side with a smile, Wang Xiwu could not help but be taken aback. Is he not allowing his wife to shake hands with other men? To be honest, Chunxi's action was indeed a little rude, and it would make him seem very narrow-minded. After all, it was a social occasion. Wang Xiwu wanted to shake hands with Qin Ruoying, who was meeting for the first time, only out of courtesy. But Chunxi's reaction. Wang Xiwu was stunned for a moment, and he could only smile awkwardly. Then he turned to shake Chunxi's hand. They were all friends, and Chunxi had attended his and Feng Lei's wedding before, so Wang Xiwu naturally could not be angry over such a small matter. Mr. Chun, you're so lucky. Your wife is so beautiful, and she gave birth to such a cute and obedient daughter for you. I'm so envious. Wang Xiwu smiled and said a few polite words to Chunxi. But after Chunxi heard this, he looked at Wang Xiwu thoughtfully, then replied with a fake smile, Thank you. After that, he withdrew his right hand. Such an impolite behavior really made Wang Xiwu a little confused. Luckily, he had a good temper. If it were a hot-tempered second-generation rich kid, he would have flipped out and smashed the bowl. What kind of attitude is this? Chunxi's behavior made the atmosphere a little awkward, and at this time, Feng Lei's voice suddenly came from the side. What? Ying is beautiful, but I'm not. She glanced at Wang Xiwu with a smile that was not a smile. She put on a jealous look, which immediately livened up the atmosphere. Beautiful. Of course you're beautiful. Your dorm mates are all very good-looking. Hearing this, Wang Xiwu immediately laughed, and then went with the excuse Feng Lei gave him. Then, Feng Lei asked everyone to take a seat, and the topic finally returned to the three women. Qin Ruoying chatted with Feng Lei for a while. When the waiter came to ask if the dishes could be served, Qin Ruoying seemed to have thought of something. She quickly asked, By the way, Xian, where's your boyfriend? Why don't I see him? Hearing this, Lin Xian immediately explained with a smile. He has to work overtime tonight, so he can't make it. I'm sorry. It's nothing, Xian. I was just asking. Qin Ruoying nodded. She and Chun-Shi were both unemployed, so she naturally had to understand the difficulties of office workers, so she didn't continue to ask. Where's Lulu? Didn't you call her? She said she would rush over as soon as she got off work. She should be here soon. Fong Lei looked down at the time on her phone and found that it was almost 6 o'clock in the evening, so she turned to look outside the door. Sure enough, not long after her voice fell, 2 figures walked in from outside the door. One of them was Wang Lu, and the other, it was Li Xiaowen, who came uninvited. The moment she saw Li Xiaowen appear, Lin Xian frowned a little unnaturally. Qin Ruoying noticed the strangeness on Lin Xian's face, but she couldn't figure out the relationship between them, so she asked softly, Is that Wang Lu's husband? No, he is Wang Lu's boss. He can be considered as Lin Xian's suitor. He has been pursuing her for several years. Oh, hearing this, Qin Ruoying nodded thoughtfully. She hadn't participated in such a social occasion for a long time. It felt so complicated. After Wang Lu and Li Xiaowen entered, they went straight to the second floor. Li Xiaowen's family and Fong Lei's family had some business dealings, so when Fong Lei got engaged, Li Xiaowen also received an invitation. In a sense, all these years, because of Wang Lu, Li Xiaowen and Fong Lei could be considered friends. Therefore, when Li Xiaowen came to the second floor, he went straight to Fong Lei and said to her with a smile, I heard from Lulu that you're having dinner here today. Coincidentally, I don't have anything going on tonight, so I wanted to shamelessly come over and freeload a meal. You don't mind, right? Of course not. Please sit anywhere. Then, Fong Lei pointed to the empty seat on the side. Li Xiaowen seemed to be very familiar with Wang Shiwu. So after greeting everyone with a smile, he sat directly next to Wang Shiwu. Lin Xian just so happened to be standing opposite him. Seeing this, Lin Xian's face suddenly turned cold. Without saying a word, she got up and sat next to Qin Ruoying, then pulled Qin Ruoying aside and whispered to her. As the host, Fong Lei saw everything clearly. Therefore, she could only sigh silently in her heart. It was a dormitory gathering. Why did it suddenly turn out like this? Fong Lei booked a Western-style long-table banquet tonight. The distance between each seat was very wide, so during the meal, there was a clear dividing line on the table. On one side was Chun-Shi's family of 3 and Lin Xian. On the other side was Fong Lei and her husband, followed by Wang Lu and Li Xiaowen. Wang Lu tried to lead the topic to Lin Xian several times, but Lin Xian acted as if she did not hear at all. She was focused on serving the little guy food, making the little guy happy. Dinner began under such a strange atmosphere. Ever since Li Xiaowen appeared, Lin Xian did not speak loudly. Everyone could see that she was very unhappy tonight. Seeing Lin Xian's bad attitude, Li Xiaowen's patience seemed to have reached its limit. Therefore, after a quick dinner, he directly said goodbye. Wang Lu could not stop him. In the end, she could only send him off with Fong Lei. Li Xiaowen stood outside the entrance of the residence. He looked at the second floor where Lin Xian was with a complicated expression. Then, as if he had finally made a decision, he put away the smile on his face and turned to leave quickly. Looking at Li Xiaowen's back as he left, even Fong Lei could not help but scold Wang Lu. Lulu, what's wrong with you? Is this how you flatter people? You know that Xian doesn't like Li Xiaowen. Do you really think that Xian will be moved by your efforts to let Xian meet Li Xiaowen? Don't be stupid, okay? If you continue to interfere with Xian's feelings, we can't even be friends anymore. After saying that, Fong Lei went back to the residence angrily, leaving Wang Lu standing outside the door in a daze. It was a dormitory gathering, but she turned it into a failed blind date. The dinner ended in this extremely unpleasant atmosphere. Wang Lu drove back by herself. Lin Xian came by taxi, so Fong Lei offered to give Lin Xian a ride, but was rejected by Lin Xian. Qin Ruoying held the little girl's hand and stood beside Chun-Shi. After watching Lin Xian get into the taxi and leave, she asked curiously, what's wrong with you? I feel that you're a little weird tonight. Hearing that, Chun-Shi smiled and shook his head. He held her hand and said softly in her ear, I feel that something big is going to happen tonight. How about this, you bring Yin back first, I'll go check on the situation. I'll be back soon. Something big. Qin Ruoying was stunned for a moment. Then a worried expression appeared on her face. Seeing that, Chunshi smiled and touched her cheek. He comforted her gently. "Don't worry, I'm here." Chapter 300. In Chunshi's eyes, the night seemed calm, but in fact it was turbulent. That was because he actually found a similarity between Wang Shiwu and Li Xiuwen, two famous second-generation princes in Zhonghai. There were signs of spiritual energy fluctuations in their bodies. This was obviously not a coincidence. The two of them could be considered old acquaintances, so Chunshi was very sure that in the past 6 months, something must have happened to them. While shaking hands with Wang Shiwu, Chunshi quietly put a trace of true yuan into his body, and then carefully studied it. Then, he found that Wang Shiwu should have practiced some kind of cultivation method, and there was obviously some impure true yuan accumulated in his body. But what made Chunshi feel a little strange was that this true yuan had a bit of a strange and evil feeling. Since Chunshi returned to Earth, he had already seen a lot of incomplete inheritances unique to Earth. Great-granduncle was a martial artist, Sunwen was a necromancer, Saitu Ijiro was a onmyoji, and there was also the Brahmin. Although these inheritances were incomplete, they could still be considered as orthodox, and in the end they could step into the celestial being. The celestial being, in the eyes of immortal cultivators, was the pseudo-core realm, and was only one step away from condensing the golden core. The reason why they could not go further was mainly because of the environmental limitations of Earth. From a scientific point of view, under the action of natural selection, the mutation of a mutated individual who was more adaptable to the environment was a beneficial mutation, and thus, they could continue to survive. And the mutation of a mutated individual, who was not adapted to the environment, was a disadvantageous mutation. Unable to adapt to the environment, they were destined to be eliminated by the environment. Therefore, no matter what kind of creature it was, in the end, it was inseparable from the 4 words natural selection, survival of the fittest. In the case of being eliminated at any time, Great-granduncle placed all his hopes on the illusory divine gate, and talented people like Sunwen tried to rely on their own efforts to continue to move forward. As long as he could go further, he was willing to pay any price, even if it meant killing innocent people. For example, the extremely evil 5 elements soul cultivation technique. One had to know that evil and filth were existences that were rejected by cultivators. It wasn't that this kind of cultivation method couldn't be cultivated, but it was because this kind of cultivation method usually went against ethics and principles. It was even harmful to the heavens and devoid of humanity. There were no taboos in doing things, and everything was done only for oneself. Therefore, this type of immortal cultivator was also called heretical cultivators. In the heavenly jade world, heretical cultivators were like street rats. They were hated by everyone. However, the environment was against evil cultivators, but their legacies were still being passed down. The main reason was that the evil path was faster, stronger, and easier to survive than the traditional cultivation methods. Yin-yang masters used their blood essence to water yin souls and create spirit-branded retainers that were related to their lives. This method was indeed a bit unorthodox compared to necromancers and martial artists, but it wasn't considered evil. After all, yin-yang masters only used their own blood essence to nourish their spirit-branded retainers, while yin-yang masters used their own blood essence and divine sense to strengthen themselves. The two could not be compared at all. Up until now, Chunshi only knew of Sunwen's 5 elements soul cultivation technique that could truly be considered evil on Earth. But Sunwen had already been subdued by him. Now, in addition to enduring the torture of the heart-devouring ants every day, he also had to work day and night for Wu Lian for free. So the question was, who was the heretical cultivator behind Wang Shiwu and Li Xiuwen? Since these two were young masters with a certain social status, it meant that many people in their circle had already fallen into the hands of the heretical cultivator. The reason why the heretical cultivator chose the 2nd generation was probably because of their social influence. After all, it was easier to commit heinous crimes without being noticed by others with power and influence. Perhaps it was because he cultivated an evil cultivation method. Li Xiuwen's behavior tonight was clearly a bit out of place. Logically speaking, it wasn't the first time that he was ignored by Lin Xian. He should have been mentally prepared. But when Li Xiaowen left, he suddenly looked meaningfully at Lin Xian. At that moment, his gaze was indeed very complicated. Thinking of this, Qinshi could not help but secretly sigh. Actually, in his heart, Li Xiaowen was quite a good person. No matter what, Li Xiaowen had wholeheartedly pursued Lin Xian for many years. Even if he had many flaws, he was not as unforgivable as Zhao Yuan. But now, Li Xiaowen's patience seemed to have finally run out. The two young masters who couldn't get along with each other had now become locusts on the same rope. Holding hands, they walked further and further away on the road of death. Wang Xiwu should have started cultivating earlier than Li Xiaowen, so his cultivation was obviously higher than Li Xiaowen's. Therefore, after some consideration, Qinshi secretly left a restriction on Lin Xian's body and turned to leave with Wang Xiwu. Wang Xiwu and Feng Lei were not officially married yet, so they did not live together. Therefore, after he drove Feng Lei home, he turned around and returned to his own house. Qinshi flew in the air and followed Wang Xiwu all the way. Qinshi could not be more familiar with Zhonghai. Therefore, after seeing Wang Xiwu drive into a high-end residential area by the river, Qinshi could not help but sneer. As the end of the Yangtze River, there were a total of 40 rivers in Zhonghai. Because there were too many rivers, even the natives of Zhonghai City didn't know the name of each river. There was only one exception, and that was the inland river in front of Qinshi called Chai River. The name Chai River was widely spread among the older generation, and it could be said that there was no one who did not know of it. The reason why Chai River was so famous was mainly because of its other name, Yinyang River. It was said that many people died here during the War of Resistance, and corpses and blood filled the entire Chai River. Therefore, this place had always been gloomy and filled with hostility. Many people scoffed at this legend. That was because they completely ignored the cemetery of martyrs that covered an area of about 200,000 square meters. This cemetery of martyrs was now called Longhua Garden, but 60 years ago, it had another famous name, Blood Flower Garden. Blood dyed the Wuxia red. The hostility was indeed heavy. After decades of development, the Blood Flower Garden went from a suburb to the current city center, and the mountains of corpses and seas of blood seemed to be covered by the dust of history. From the current perspective, the residential area where Wang Xiwu lived was actually not bad. Facing the Chai River, it was quiet in the midst of chaos, and it had a unique flavor. However, if one looked down from the sky, they would find that this residential area faced the Yinyang River, and had the Blood Flower Garden behind it. It was simply a place where evil gathered. The residential area was called Longhua Villa, and it was a high-end area. Some of it were bungalows, while the rest were all detached villas. Since it was a detached villa, there was naturally a small garden in each villa. Qinshi silently landed outside Wang Xiwu's garden, and silently watched Wang Xiwu park the car, and then return to the villa door. However, the moment Wang Xiwu opened the door, Qinshi's line of sight unimpeded went directly from the front yard to the back garden. Seeing through the entire villa at a glance, one had to know that from the perspective of feng shui, this kind of house layout was legendary. Heart-piercing evil spirit. The number one evil spirit of the Yang Mansion. Chapter 301. The place where the living lived was called the Yang Residence, and the place where the dead lived was called the Yin Residence. Since it was a place where the living lived, it naturally had to pay attention to feng shui. The so-called heart-piercing evil spirit actually referred to the kind of residence where one could see the other end of the house at a glance while standing outside the door. As one of the 10 great evil spirits of feng shui, heart-piercing evil spirit had been a taboo existence for the people of Wuxia since ancient times. Now that the real estate industry was at its peak, the architectural design profession naturally became a popular profession. Not to mention the local architectural designers of Wuxia. Even those famous foreign designers who didn't know much about the traditional culture of Wuxia would absolutely not be stupid enough to design a house with heart-piercing evil spirit pattern. After all, feng shui was something passed down by the ancestors, and was an indispensable and important part of Wuxia's culture. If the developer really wanted to sell a house with heart-piercing evil spirit pattern in Wuxia, It was estimated that before the official opening, the sales department would be filled with wreaths by some nosy old people, although there were many young people who didn't understand this, and some of them wanted to pursue something different, and wanted to knock down a wall in their own house and forcibly create a heart-piercing evil spirit pattern. Then the renovation company or workers with some experience should also kindly remind them, don't court death. Of course, the more auspicious the house, the better. Although living in a house with heart-piercing evil spirit didn't mean that one would be unlucky. But if they were really unlucky, who would they blame? They could only blame themselves for being too stubborn at that time. Longhua Courtyard faced the Inyang River, and backed by the Bloodflower Garden. This location itself was very bad. And if the heart-piercing evil spirit pattern was added, where was the Yang residence? It was clearly a place of great evil that even the dead didn't want to stay in. As the saying goes, a fall into the pit, a gain in your wit. These seemingly mysterious and superstitious cultural inheritances were actually like the lunar calendar. It was knowledge that the ancestors used thousands of years to accumulate. In Chen Shi's view, feng shui was actually the simplest application of array. Why was the feng shui of Longhua Courtyard said that the feng shui was bad? Mainly because the spiritual energy of heaven and earth in this place was extremely sparse. The spiritual energy of heaven and earth was the foundation of all things. And this place was perfectly round, forming a sealed space. The heaven and earth spirit chi from the outside couldn't come in, and the yin and evil chi accumulated inside. If ordinary people stayed here for a long time, it was easy for them to get sick. This was the so-called yang deficiency in Chinese medicine. Chen Shi took the opportunity to look at the few villas next to him, and found that none of them had the same layout as Wang Shiwu's house. This meant that the heart-piercing fiend pattern was deliberately set up by Wang Shiwu. Thinking of this, Chen Shi couldn't help but sigh in his heart. He was truly puzzled. Wang Shiwu was originally such a positive and outstanding young man. How could he fall so easily? Perhaps it was because humans were creatures that were unwilling to be satisfied with their current situation. When money, fame, and power were at their fingertips, they would pursue other things. Just like what countless emperors pursued throughout their lives. Enjoy immortal blessings forever, and live as long as the heavens. Chen Shi used his true essence to conceal his figure, at the same time shielding himself from all sounds. Just like a ghost, he followed Wang Shiwu into the villa. The doors and windows of the villa were closed, and thick curtains were drawn all around. After Wang Shiwu entered the door, he only turned on the light at the entrance, so this huge villa looked a little gloomy and scary. Wang Shiwu put on his slippers and went straight to the second floor. Because there weren't many furnishings in the room, his footsteps suddenly echoed in this empty room. Tap, tap, tap. The layout of the second floor was similar to the first floor, but there was no kitchen, and there was a study. Wang Shiwu didn't seem to like the light, so he just turned on the aisle light in the corridor. Under the dim light, Wang Shiwu's shadow was very long, and it even looked a little hideous when it was reflected on the wall. He seemed to value his study very much, so he specially installed a fingerprint lock on the door. Wang Shiwu stretched out his finger. With a soft beep, the door of the study opened. Chen Shi stood behind Wang Shiwu, quietly watching his every move. Although it was impossible for Wang Shiwu to see through Chen Shi's disguise with his cultivation, he seemed to have noticed something, so he couldn't help but look back. On the dim second floor, there was only an empty living room, a dark corridor, and a few bedrooms with their doors tightly shut. There was nothing strange. Wang Shiwu frowned and walked to the window. After checking that the doors and windows were closed, he came back to the study. Then, he gently pushed the door open and entered. A cold wind suddenly blew out of the study. At the same time, there was a faint moldy smell in the room. It was similar to the smell when clothes were not dried in winter, and were directly put into the wardrobe and opened in spring. It wasn't smelly, but it still made people feel a little uncomfortable. Wang Shiwu walked into the study, but he still didn't turn on the light, but walked to the bookshelf in the dark. Just like in a treasure hunting movie, Wang Shiwu actually set up a mechanism behind the bookshelf. He pressed the mechanism, and the bookshelf slowly opened like a curtain, revealing the hidden dark room behind it. This was a room about 20 to 30 square meters. In addition to the side where the bookshelf was located, there were shelves similar to bookshelves on the 3 walls of the dark room. However, there were not books on the shelves, but transparent glass jars one after another. These jars were the same as the jars used to soak white wine in restaurants, but what was soaked in them was not wine, but a newly formed fetus. Seeing such a strange and terrifying scene, Wang Shiwu's face didn't change at all, as if he was used to it. After walking into the dark room, he sat straight on the futon in the center of the dark room. Then Wang Shiwu closed his eyes and prepared to start tonight's cultivation. Chen Shi stood silently behind Wang Shiwu. Even facing the light, there was still no shadow behind him. It was like a ghost. And it was a ghost that came to claim his life in the night of the 7th reincarnation. Chen Shi didn't know why he was so angry. After all, with his temperament, even if the sky fell, he shouldn't panic at all. But now, Chen Shi was infuriated by the arrangement in front of her. If he was still immortal, his temples would probably be throbbing crazily at this moment. In addition to anger, there was more anger. It was too hateful. What was a fetus? To put it simply, it was a child that had already developed, but had not yet been born from the mother's belly. The fetus had not yet been born, so naturally it was not contaminated with the turbid air of the world, so it could also be regarded as the purest vitality condensed from the essence of the mother's body. Why would Wang Shiwu choose such an evil place that didn't even have the spiritual energy of heaven and earth as his cultivation place? Wasn't it because he didn't need to work hard to refine the spiritual energy of heaven and earth into vital essence? As long as he used this evil and bizarre technique, he would be able to extract the energy from one fetus after another. Just like pouring tea, he would be able to pour the energy directly into his dantian, thus saving him the time needed to refine the natural energy of heaven and earth. Chapter 302. In the dark room, the glass jars were neatly arranged on the shelves, one after another, and there were at least 70 to 80 of them. In other words, at least 70 to 80 little lives had been ruthlessly taken away before they could even let out their first cry. Although the yuan qi in the fetus was pure, how old was the child? How much primordial qi could a young body contain? Therefore, although there were only 70 to 80 glass jars in the dark room, the number of innocent victims was definitely more than that. God knows how many lively and lovely children this bastard had killed. This set of evil cultivation method was actually somewhat similar to Sun Wen's 5-element soul cultivation technique. But Sun Wen used living people while Wang Shiwu used fetuses. In Chen Shi's view, even if these fetuses were bought by Wang Shiwu with money, it was an absolutely unforgivable sin. But, although he was angry, Chen Shi did not immediately act out, but quietly wandered around the room. He wanted to see where Wang Shiwu learned these crooked methods from. Sure enough, after Chen Shi wandered around the room, he found that there was something like a secret manual on the table in front of Wang Shiwu. Walking over to take a look, he saw that there were 4 large words written in traditional script. Corpse Infant Soul Transference. Chen Shi roughly glanced at the contents recorded in the secret manual, and found that this set of cultivation method was indeed extremely evil, and even went against any cultivation method he knew of on Earth. Although the content of Wang Shiwu's current cultivation method was very superficial, but Chen Shi roughly deduced according to the core of this set of cultivation method, and found that this set of cultivation method was actually self-contained, and was completely feasible in theory. A perfect set of cultivation method that did not require the spiritual qi of heaven and earth, and purely relied on absorbing the yuan qi of others. This also meant that the person who cultivated this set of cultivation method would not be limited by the sparse spiritual qi of earth. As long as there was an endless supply of yuan qi, then he could smoothly break through to the celestial level, condense the golden core, and form the yuan ying. Then there was a problem. Just who was the one who created such an extremely evil cultivation method? Since he was able to create such a cultivation method, then regardless of whether this person was good or evil, he could definitely be called a genius. Thinking of this, Chen Shi couldn't help but make a guess. Could it be? Was this person also from the heavenly gates? But after thinking about it carefully, Chen Shi felt that this guess didn't seem to be too reliable. After all, he'd already fought by Hong's group. Although the cultivation method used by Bai Hong's group was very different from the immortal cultivation method that Chen Shi knew, the core of their cultivation was still qi refining. They still had to cultivate to be able to transform the spiritual energy of heaven and earth into their own use. This was the most traditional, and also the most reliable way of cultivation. If they were to be compared to the factions of the characters in Wuxia dramas, White Rainbow's group could be called the righteous faction, and the person who created the evil cultivation method must be a big villain. It was impossible for the two to come together. Chen Shi frowned and looked at the contents of the secret book. He then turned to look at Wang Xiwu, who was sitting on the futon and cultivating. At this time, Wang Xiwu seemed to have noticed the strangeness in the room, so he immediately opened his eyes. Chen Shi. The moment he saw Chen Shi's figure, Wang Xiwu's body trembled violently. Obviously, he was shocked by the sudden appearance of Chen Shi. Chen Shi. You. Why are you here? Wang Xiwu stared with his eyes and mouth wide open, looking at Chen Shi with a shocked expression. Probably because he was too shocked, there was even a blank expression on his face. This place was his biggest secret, but now it was unreservedly displayed in front of Chen Shi. How could Wang Xiwu not panic? You followed me? Seeing that Chen Shi didn't speak, a fierce light flashed across Wang Xiwu's face, and the temperament on his body suddenly became somewhat ferocious. Chen Shi stood not far in front of Wang Xiwu, looking at him condescendingly. Wang Xiwu usually wore a pair of gold-rimmed glasses and a tailored suit. He looked completely like a refined and successful person. But now, Wang Xiwu suddenly tore off that layer of disguise and completely showed his true side in front of Chen Shi. Chen Shi didn't speak. Wang Xiwu looked around in bewilderment. When he was sure that there was only Chen Shi here, his face suddenly showed a very strange smile. Very well, since you found out, then don't blame me for being ruthless. After that, Wang Xiwu suddenly jumped up from the futon and slammed his palm on Chen Shi's chest. Wang Xiwu's speed was very fast. The moment he made his move, Wang Xiwu's arm suddenly became like the roots of a tree. His blood vessels protruded, and a layer of dark brown spots and wrinkles appeared on his skin. It looked very strange. Wang Xiwu was Fang Lei's fiancé, and Fang Lei was Qin Ruoying's best friend. Logically speaking, he and Chen Shi were actually very close. What a pity. Wang Xiwu rushed at Chen Shi with a ferocious smile. Just as he was about to hit Chen Shi finally made a move. He suddenly raised his right hand, and like the action of smashing a ball in table tennis, he slammed his palm down heavily. Slap. If Chen Shi's hand was a table tennis racket, then Wang Xiwu's face was obviously a table tennis racket. Wang Xiwu was immediately sent flying with a solid slap on his face. Bang. With a huge muffled sound, Wang Xiwu's body hit the wall heavily, knocking over a lot of glass jars. The glass shards flew in all directions and fell to the ground with a series of pleasant sounds. You. Who the hell are you? Wang Xiwu covered his face and struggled to get up from the ground. When he looked at Chen Shi again, his eyes were full of shock and disbelief. With his current cultivation, he was basically equivalent to a warrior in the profound mastery of gang state. Why didn't he have a chance to fight back in front of Chen Shi? It was like a 3-year-old child fighting with an adult. His opponent could easily slap him until he couldn't find his bearings. How was this possible? Wang Xiwu stared at Chen Shi in a daze. This friend, who was eating at the same table with him just now, had become so strange. Tell me, who taught you these things? Chen Shi looked at Wang Xiwu expressionlessly. Under his gaze, Wang Xiwu suddenly felt like he was being pressed down by a mountain, so heavy that he almost couldn't breathe. Wang Xiwu trembled as he tried to resist the pressure, but at this time, Chen Shi suddenly let out a cold snort. Humph! Chen Shi's voice was very soft, but when it reached Wang Xiwu's ears, it was like a thunderclap. It immediately scattered the pneuma that Wang Xiwu secretly gathered, and even made him kneel down powerlessly on the spot. The huge gap between the two sides seemed to wake Wang Xiwu up. Chapter 303. A strange expression appeared on Chen Shi's face as he looked at Wang Xiwu, who was kneeling on the ground and howling in agony. You turn the page faster than you turn hostile. Don't you think your actions are very low? Hearing this, Wang Shiwu could not help but be stunned. He hurriedly raised his head, as if wanting to explain something. However, at this moment, Chen Shi continued, "Save you? Then tell me, how should I save you?" Chen Shi looked at Wang Shiwu with a cold expression. He really wanted to hear what kind of story he would come up with. Accidentally entered an evil cult organization, and in the end, fell deeper and deeper, unable to escape. Now that he finally repents, I only ask that you give him a chance to turn over a new leaf? Isn't this plot a little too old-fashioned? Chen Shi added scenes for Wang Shiwu in his heart, but Wang Shiwu did not seem to have the consciousness to become an actor. When he heard the sarcasm in Chen Shi's tone, he begged bitterly, "With your abilities, your status in the Wu Lian must be quite high, right? Chen Shi, with our relationship, even if you don't give face to the monk, give face to the Buddha, give face to Lei Lei, can you let me go today? I promise that as long as I can escape this disaster, I will repay you many times over in the future." After hearing Wang Shiwu's words, Chen Shi did not know whether to laugh or cry. He originally thought that Wang Shiwu would come up with some story to deceive him, but he did not expect that Wang Shiwu did not realize what he was doing at all. The only reason he was begging for mercy was because he was afraid of being caught by the Wu Lian. From the looks of it, he should have joined of his own accord, and not been forced by someone. Since Wang Shiwu was so afraid of the Wu Lian, it meant that the Wu Lian should have started investigating them long ago. It was just that they did not find any evidence, so they did not do anything to them. Thinking of this, Chen Shi nodded lightly, as if agreeing to Wang Shiwu's request. Seeing this, Wang Shiwu could not help but be overjoyed. He struggled to get up from the ground, but no matter how hard he tried, that mountain-like invisible pressure still pressed him firmly to the ground, and he couldn't stand up no matter what. "Don't worry, tell me what's going on first. Who taught you these things? Otherwise, I won't be able to answer to the higher-ups." Seeing that Chen Shi didn't seem to be joking, Wang Shiwu hesitated for a moment, then clenched his teeth and said, "Fine. I'll talk. It's actually like this." After that, Wang Shiwu briefly explained the reason why he learned this kind of evil cultivation method. About half a year ago, not long after his engagement with Feng Lei, Wang Shiwu joined an organization called the Jinli sect under the recommendation of a friend. The way this organization recruited members was very simple, and that was through one-on-one referrals. The recommended person must be under the age of 40 and have a certain social status. Only after the approval of the church's board of directors can they enter the church. In other words, this was a cult organization that took the high-end route. What was different from ordinary cult organizations was that the Jinli sect didn't show too obvious antisocial nature. After joining the sect, one only needed to pay a considerable fee, and the member would be able to obtain a cultivation method that was known as a supreme secret technique. In fact, it was the simplest set of qi cultivation methods. When this member succeeded in qi cultivation, and found that his physical fitness had greatly improved, he would naturally be more convinced of the Jinli sect. After that, if the member still wanted to obtain a higher level of cultivation method, he would need to do something for the Jinli sect in exchange for the approval of the board of directors. Only then could he officially become a believer of the Jinli sect. Of course, only after officially becoming a believer of the Jinli sect could he obtain this set of corpse baby soul crossing, which was known as the cult secret technique. Wang Shiwu's explanation was very simple. After listening for a while, Chen Shi roughly understood how this cult operated. Wasn't this an upgraded version of pyramid schemes blockchain? The evil cultivation method was originally a shortcut. It could let people taste the benefits in a short time, so it was naturally very tempting. Thinking of this, Chen Shi couldn't help but ask curiously, "You're a believer, right? Then what did you do for the Jinli sect back then?" Hearing this, an obvious unnatural expression flashed across Wang Shiwu's face, but soon he pretended to be casual and said, "I paid 20 million as a membership fee and recommended 3 friends to join the sect. Then I can become a believer." After saying that, Wang Shiwu raised his head and looked at Chen Shi. After seeing that Chen Shi's eyes were still very cold, Wang Shiwu quickly lowered his head again. It was obvious that he was lying. However, Chen Shi didn't seem to have the intention to delve deeper. Instead, he changed the question and asked, Where is the headquarters of the Zhenli sect? I don't know about this. The church has a one-to-one referral system. I usually meet the referral at the club we often go to, so I don't have to go to the headquarters. Don't you need the approval of the steward to become a believer? Who's the steward? I don't know. Wang Shiwu shook his head and continued. I haven't seen the steward with my own eyes. We usually have a video call, and I have to wear a mask when I talk. After saying that, Wang Shiwu pointed to the golden mask on the table. This time, Wang Shiwu wasn't lying. He really hadn't seen the steward, and he really didn't know where the headquarters of the Zhenli sect was. Chen Shi frowned and pondered for a while. When he was about to continue asking, Chen Shi suddenly frowned. Because the restriction on Lin Xian's body was triggered. When he left just now, Chen Shi quietly placed a restriction on Lin Xian's body. Now that the restriction was triggered, it meant that someone was trying to get close to Lin Xian. As expected, after only a few seconds, Chen Shi noticed that the self-defense pendant he gave Lin Xian had been activated. Someone was trying to hurt her. When he noticed all this, Chen Shi's figure disappeared from Wang Shiwu's sight almost instantly. Wang Shiwu stared blankly at the spot where Chen Shi was just now. After a long while he struggled to stand up, but it was still in vain. He could only helplessly shout in the dark room. Chen Shi? Chen Shi? Where did you go? Let me go first. Of course, Chen Shi didn't have time to deal with Wang Shiwu now. When Li Xiaowen was eating just now, there was an evil aura around him. Before he left, he took a deep look at Lin Xian. Therefore, Chen Shi was very vigilant and placed a restriction on Lin Xian. Destroy what you can't get? He didn't expect Li Xiaowen to take this step after all. Chen Shi quickly rushed to Lin Xian's location, only to find that Lin Xian had been moving, and at a very fast speed. Could it be she's already been abducted? Thinking of this, Chen Shi couldn't help but change his expression slightly. There were a total of 3 pieces of the self-defense pendant he made. One was on Aunt Zhang, one was on Nian Nian, and the last one was on Lin Xian. No matter what, it was a magic tool that he made personally. Although the materials were crude, it shouldn't be damaged so quickly, right? Chapter 304. Rewind time to half an hour ago. After Lin Xian left in a taxi, Li Xiaowen, who had left early, suddenly appeared out of nowhere and followed Lin Xian all the way back to her neighborhood. However, Li Xiaowen did not follow Lin Xian into the neighborhood. Instead, he called Lin Xian from outside the neighborhood, implying that he wanted to talk to her face to face. He had pursued Lin Xian for many years, and this time he seemed to have finally thought it through, so he wanted to meet with Lin Xian one last time. They could chat as friends, and it could be considered as a farewell. From then on, he would not disturb her anymore. After hearing Li Xiaowen's heartfelt confession, Lin Xian was silent on the other end of the phone. She held her phone in one hand and pulled open the curtains with the other. In the hazy city at night, the flashing neon lights could not illuminate the deepest corner of her heart. At this moment, the scene was similar to what Huang Jingren described in Qi Huai. Sitting under the flowers and playing the flute, gazing into the distance through the red walls. As if this star was not last night, for whom the wind and dew stood in the middle of the night. Lingering thoughts are exhausted, turning the heartache and peeling the banana. 3 to 5 years, 3 to 5 months. The pitiful cup of wine has not disappeared. The pitiful cup of wine has not disappeared. The bitterness of the world is no greater than the bitterness of infatuation. It had to be said that this kind of infatuated man's image could easily soften a woman's heart. Therefore, after much consideration, Lin Xian agreed to his request. She then went downstairs to Li Xiaowen's car to have a good talk with him. In reality, the reason why Lin Xian usually gave Li Xiaowen the cold shoulder was not because she really disliked Li Xiaowen, but because she did not want Li Xiaowen to waste too much time on her. Lin Xian was a rational woman, but at the same time, she was a kind woman. Because of this, she never gave Li Xiaowen a good look. She only hoped that he would back off in the face of difficulties and not take any chances. After all, after so many years, even if you raised a dog, you would still have some feelings for it. Moreover, was that still a human? But it was a pity. Lin Xian's heart already belonged to someone, and her attitude towards relationships was very extreme. She would never allow herself to compromise. As the saying goes, when one's heart is moved, it means that one is heartless. Lin Xian reluctantly got into the car. One had to know that ever since Li Xiaowen officially started pursuing her, Lin Xian had never sat in Li Xiaowen's car again. Therefore, when she sat in Li Xiaowen's car, she clearly felt uncomfortable. Lin Xian felt awkward, but Li Xiaowen was very excited. Perhaps he was afraid of scaring Lin Xian, so Li Xiaowen suppressed his voice and said to Lin Xian in a slightly restrained manner, Xian, it's not like you don't know my feelings for you. Before he finished, Li Xian interrupted. I. His resolute tone and the emotionless directorly completely widened the gap between the two of them. Lin Xian's attitude was so bad that it seemed to be out of Li Xiaowen's expectations. He was stunned. At this moment, he no longer had the attitude of a rich second-generation heir, or a big boss of a corporation. He was just a sad loser. Seeing Li Xiaowen at a loss, Lin Xian's heart softened. Therefore, after a soft sigh, Lin Xian said gently, I'm sorry, I really don't have any feelings for you. So I have to express my attitude clearly, in case you misunderstand. I hope you can understand. Li Xiaowen was silent. The car suddenly became quiet. After a while, he asked in a heavy tone, Then are we still friends? Hearing this, Lin Xian hesitated for a moment, then said helplessly, It better not be. Then Lin Xian was ready to open the door and get out of the car. She and Li Xiaowen were not considered friends. This time, she made it clear so that he would completely give up. To be honest, Lin Xian did not want to hurt others like this, but when it came to relationships, it would be messy. It was better to be less conflicted and more decisive. While thinking, Lin Xian pulled the car door, but realized that the door was locked. Therefore, she said to Li Xiaowen, Please open the door, I should go back. However, Li Xiaowen did not seem to hear her. He held the steering wheel with both hands and lowered his head. She did not know what he was thinking. Seeing this, Lin Xian suddenly felt a little scared, so she said again, Xiao Li, it's late, I have to go to work tomorrow. Please open the door, I should go back. After saying that, Lin Xian tried to push the car door again, but she couldn't push it open. This car was probably modified, so once it was locked, only the driver could unlock it. Lin Xian had no choice but to turn around and try to persuade Li Xiaowen to open the door. But just as she turned around, Li Xiaowen suddenly started the car. Stepping on the accelerator, the car suddenly rushed out like a horse that had lost control. The huge inertia caused Lin Xian to fall heavily on the back of the seat. After regaining her senses, Lin Xian shouted in panic, Stop the car! Stop the car! I want to get out! I'm calling the police! As she shouted, Lin Xian took out her phone to call the police. Seeing this, Li Xiaowen suddenly swung the steering wheel, and the car suddenly drifted on the road. This also caused Lin Xian to lose her balance, and the phone in her hand flew out. Lin Xian was completely flustered. She could only hit Li Xiaowen's shoulder and screamed, Stop the car! Let me out! Shut up! Li Xiaowen glared fiercely at Lin Xian, and then sped up again. Accompanied by the loud sound of the engine, the car suddenly rushed out at an extremely fast speed. Lin Xian was frightened by Li Xiaowen's behavior. Out of consideration for her own safety, she did not dare to do anything that might anger him. She could only curl up in the front passenger seat and hold on tightly to the seatbelt. Her careful look made her look especially helpless. Li Xiaowen brought Lin Xian and sped through the city. Not long after, he brought Lin Xian to a church-like building. Then, Li Xiaowen violently pulled Lin Xian out of the car, and then dragged her straight to the church. What are you doing? Let me go. Lin Xian struggled with all her might, but she was a woman who did not weigh more than 100 pounds. How could she win against a young and strong man? Moreover, Li Xiaowen's strength seemed to be exceptionally great. Using only one hand, he was able to easily drag her into the church as if she was a chicken. Xian, did you know? I once swore. Chapter 305. Let me go. Let me go. Save me. Help. Save me. Lin Xian screamed as she used her nails to scratch at Li Xiaowen's arm. However, Li Xiaowen's arm was like a steel plate, and no matter how hard Lin Xian tried, it was futile. At the same time, because she used too much strength, she broke a lot of her carefully trimmed nails, and her fingertips started to bleed. Lin Xian's screams were very loud, but Li Xiaowen did not care, and dragged her like a sack towards the church. The church's door was not locked, and Li Xiaowen gave it a push, and the door slowly opened. Then he dragged Lin Xian into the church. But the strange thing was, it was nighttime, but the church that should have been closed a long time ago was brightly lit. The lights shone on the colorful window decorations on both sides, silently giving off a solemn and dignified feeling. Then this solemn atmosphere was broken by Lin Xian's screams. There was no one in the large hall, and Li Xiaowen dragged Lin Xian on the red carpet in the middle, and the commotion they made seemed to have alerted the church staff. Following a series of light footsteps, a figure walked out from the depths of the church. That person was about 40 or 50 years old, dressed as a priest, and had a cross pendant around his neck. He looked like the priest in charge of this church. Lin Xian made a lot of noise, but the priest acted as if he did not hear it. After he appeared from the passage, he went straight to the altar in the middle of the church, and then calmly looked at the pair of young people in front of him. Li Xiaowen dragged Lin Xian to the altar, and finally let go of Lin Xian's arm. Perhaps because she struggled too hard, Lin Xian was now completely exhausted, and so she laid on the carpet on the spot. At this moment, Li Xiaowen lowered his head slightly and said respectfully to the priest standing behind the altar, "Steward Sun, I want this woman to fall in love with me wholeheartedly and never leave me for the rest of her life. Sorry to trouble you." Hearing this, the priest who was addressed as Steward Sun took a deep look at Li Xiaowen, then asked calmly, "Just for a woman? Do you know what price you have to pay? You only have one chance. You'd better think carefully before answering me." After hearing Steward Sun's words, Li Xiaowen hesitated for a moment. But when he looked at Lin Xian, who was lying beside him, he fiercely gritted his teeth and solemnly nodded in response. "I know. I have no regrets. Manager Sun, sorry to trouble you." "Very good. The Heavenly Father has heard your words. Now, it is time for you to listen to the gospel." The priest nodded. Then he raised his right hand and pointed his index finger at Lin Xian. At this moment, Lin Xian was like an injured rabbit. She could only kneel on the ground weakly. She tried her best to distance herself from Li Xiaowen, but at this moment, an invisible force suddenly surrounded her. Ah! Feeling the strange feeling in her body, Lin Xian could not help but cry out in surprise. She wanted to struggle, but the invisible force tightened around her. It was like a cloth wrapped around a mummy. Layer after layer, it wrapped around her until she could not move. Just as Lin Xian was about to be crushed by this force until she could not breathe, the pendant in front of her chest suddenly exploded with an extremely dazzling light. Seeing this, Steward Sun could not help but look at her in astonishment. He softly muttered, "A magical weapon?" Like an eggshell, the light that exploded from the pendant instantly enveloped Lin Xian. Steward Sun carefully looked at the cover that was formed by the light. Suddenly, a look of disdain appeared on his face. A crude piece of work. As soon as he finished speaking, Steward Sun suddenly clenched his right hand tightly. An enormous force instantly surged from all directions and crazily squeezed the light cover. In just a few breaths' time, the inferior Guanyin statue that cost Qinshi 100 yuan was instantly shattered like glass. It was turned into fine powder by this force. With the protective magical weapon losing its effect, Lin Xian instantly became a fish on the chopping board. She could only wait to be slaughtered. Then Steward Sun waved his right hand. Lin Xian's body slowly flew up and landed on the altar in front of him. Lin Xian lay on the altar, unable to move. As she was too scared, she had long turned pale with fright and tears streamed down her face. "Help! Who can save me?" Lin Xian tried her best to cry for help, but her throat seemed to be blocked by something. She could only let out a desperate whimper. At this moment, Steward Sun looked at Li Xiaowen again. He then handed a golden dagger to him. "Come here and drip your blood into the holy water pool. Then let this woman drink the holy water. From today onwards, everything about her belongs to you, including her soul." Hearing this, Li Xiaowen immediately took the dagger. Then he followed Steward Sun's instructions and walked to the side of the holy water pool. He used the dagger to lightly cut his fingertip. When the sharp dagger cut his skin, Li Xiaowen instantly felt a piercing pain. The pain seemed to come from the depths of his soul. He could not help but let out a blood-curdling scream. However, despite the pain, Li Xiaowen did not forget Steward Sun's instructions. He hurriedly extended his finger above the holy water pool. A drop of dark red blood slid from his fingertip and fell directly into the pool below. Then Li Xiaowen picked up the Holy Grail from the table beside him. He used the Holy Grail to scoop a cup of holy water mixed with his blood into the pool. Then he turned around and walked to Lin Xian. Although Lin Xian could not move, she heard their conversation clearly. So when she saw Li Xiaowen walking to her side with the cup, Lin Xian instantly let out a series of emotional sobs. Bean-sized teardrops kept falling from the corners of her eyes. In a daze, she remembered that day again, that dilapidated building that leaked air everywhere. That figure that suddenly appeared. I don't know why. This time, Lin Xian really hoped that Qinshi could come in time. Therefore, even if she could not make any sound, she was crazily screaming in her heart. Qinshi, save me. Perhaps it was because the Jesus statue on the altar heard her prayer. So just as Li Xiaowen was about to feed her the holy water with the Holy Grail, the door of the church was suddenly pushed open. It was not right to say that it was pushed open because the two doors were directly sent flying. It was as if they were hit by an ancient battering ram. The two 3-meter-tall heavy doors were knocked off their frames and flew directly into the church. Then they crashed into rows of seats. At this point, Qinshi deliberately paused and then asked with a smile, "If you didn't say it, I would have thought that this is a garbage collection center, and all kinds of garbage are stuffed in here. How dare you?" Seeing Qinshi's nonchalant expression, Steward Sun could not help but be furious. He scolded sternly, "Ignorant child, is my universal truth sect a place for you to be presumptuous?" After saying that, Steward Sun suddenly raised his right hand, and a ball of flame suddenly jumped out of his palm. After that, without seeing any action from Steward Sun, the ball of flame suddenly burned fiercely, and then turned into countless lifelike flame crows. They flapped their wings crazily and pounced toward Qinshi from all directions. Seeing this, a cold smile suddenly appeared on the corner of Qinshi's mouth. With a wave of his hand, an invisible force suddenly blew away all the fire crows like a hurricane. After seeing Qinshi's move, Steward Sun's expression changed slightly. He frowned and said, "Celestial. Why? Are you scared?" Qinshi looked at Steward Sun with a mocking gaze. After that, he raised his index finger and said slowly, "I'll give you another chance to attack. Cherish it. I hope you can show me something different." Hearing this, Steward Sun could not help but fly into a rage. How dare a mere celestial speak so arrogantly? If that's the case, then I'll show you today. What is a god? As soon as he finished speaking, the black robe on Steward Sun's body suddenly fluttered, and a gloomy and cold aura immediately spread in the main hall. As Li Xiaowen was too close to Steward Sun, he instantly felt as if he had fallen into a 10,000-year-old ice cave. It was so cold that he almost could not breathe. Qinshi looked at Steward Sun silently. He sensed that there was a surge of power in Steward Sun's body, and this power was being released bit by bit. If there was no accident, then it should be the primordial core that he condensed by using the evil technique. Primordial core, golden core. There was only a difference of one word, but the meaning was completely different. The so-called golden core was the condensation of all the true essence in an immortal cultivator's entire body to a point. After that, it would undergo repeated compression and tempering. Like refining pills, the impurities would be removed and the essence would be extracted. Finally, it would be formed into a ball and stored in the dantian. It sounded very simple, but condensing a golden core was not an easy task. It was like rolling a piece of foil into a small ball. It was very easy. However, after rolling it into a ball, it had to be hammered bit by bit until it was solid. Only after being hammered thousands of times could this piece of foil be turned into a complete and flawless metal ball. And if the number of hammering was not enough, even if this piece of foil had been molded into a small metal ball, there would still be many flaws in it. This was because its structure was not complete, and it was only a superficial appearance. Just as the old saying goes, a 1,000-mile dike would collapse because of an ant's nest. As long as the flaw of the small ball was found, it would naturally be easy to shatter and disintegrate the small ball. Therefore, this kind of flawed golden core was also called the primordial core. Logically speaking, since an immortal cultivator had already formed the primordial core, it was only a matter of time before they condensed it into a golden core. However, because Steward Sun cultivated an evil technique that relied on absorbing the essence of other people's souls to nourish himself, and this technique itself was not a top-notch technique, in the long run, the impurities in his body would far exceed that of an ordinary immortal cultivator. Therefore, when he was refining his golden core, he would naturally spend more time than others. However, even if Steward Sun had not truly condensed his golden core, he was still the first existence that Chun-Shi had met on Earth that surpassed the celestial being level. At the same time, he was also the first existence that dared to call himself a god in front of Chun-Shi. It was really Chapter 307. Although Steward Sun was dressed as a priest, an extremely evil aura suddenly surged out of his body in his rage. And this was obviously his true face. This Xunli sect that used religious beliefs to recruit members was actually more like the heretical demons that often appeared in Wuxia dramas. As long as it was beneficial to them, they would do anything and everything. Therefore, when Steward Sun opened his arms and let out a long howl, his body suddenly emitted a lot of black fog, which looked very strange. After the black fog appeared from Steward Sun's body, it kept changing its shape. It was like thousands of ferocious human faces that were baring their fangs and brandishing their claws as they hovered in mid-air. What was even more frightening was that these human faces seemed to be alive as they kept letting out ear-piercing screams. In an instant, the originally solemn and sacred church had turned into an incomparably evil place of ghosts. The temperature in the air suddenly dropped, and a gloomy and cold feeling enveloped everyone present. Ghost. Ghost. Perhaps it was because he had not been in the sect for long and had not come into contact with too many core secrets. Even Li Xiaowen was so frightened that he could not help but take a few steps back when he saw such a terrifying scene. In reality, weren't these ghostly shadows floating in the air the innocent lives that Steward Sun had harmed all these years because of his cultivation of evil techniques? Not only did he harm people's lives and steal their souls, but he also bound the souls of innocent people in his body as a means of attack. He did not even let the dead off. This kind of heinous and inhumane cruel behavior was probably only done by an evil cultivator. You're a celestial, right? It just so happens that my 1,000 ghosts devouring soul still lacks a ghost king. I'll leave this position to you. After a violent howl, Steward Sun's body shook violently. Immediately after, the thousands of ghostly shadows were like dark clouds that covered the sun as they suddenly pressed down on Chun-Shi. Sinluo Purgatory, 100 Ghosts Parade. Demons and monsters, 1,000 ghosts devouring soul. Faced with such a terrifying scene, Chun-Shi's mind suddenly thought of something else. When he had just met Ning Zhonghua had asked him to treat his old friend, Zhang Jiada. Didn't Zhang Jiada's youngest son, Zhang Hongyuan, specially cultivate an evil technique to torture his father? This evil technique, wasn't it of the same origin as the evil technique that Steward Sun was using now? As it turned out, the Xunli sect had started to recruit believers long ago, but they were not as unscrupulous as they were now. The shadow was about to arrive, but Chun-Shi was still thinking about some unimportant questions, as if he did not take Steward Sun seriously at all. Manager Sun couldn't help but laugh coldly when he saw this, and then he crossed his arms and prepared to admire Chun-Shi's painful appearance when the myriad of ghosts devoured his heart. However, when these Yin spirits rushed in front of Chun-Shi, they were like vampires that had suddenly seen sunlight, suddenly letting out a sharp and ear-piercing howl. Immediately after, these ghosts were like the shadows before dawn, disappearing the moment they saw the sunlight. This soul-devouring 10,000 ghosts has lost its effect. Steward Sun's eyes widened as if he couldn't believe what was happening before his eyes. From the beginning to the end, Chunshi stood on the spot without moving. He didn't even lift his eyelids. However, the thousands of Een spirits that he had painstakingly collected all these years melted like snow, and almost all of them disappeared in an instant, leaving only a few scattered souls hovering above the dome of the church. There wasn't even a splash, and everything returned to normal. What exactly happened? Steward Sun's mind was blank, and he was really stunned by what was happening before his eyes. Boring. Seeing Steward Sun's puzzled look, Chunshi couldn't help but shake his head slightly, and then he slowly walked toward the altar. The soul-devouring 10,000 ghosts was a soul attack, so it wasn't as gorgeous as ordinary spells, but its lethality wasn't inferior to sword techniques, spells, and so on. However, it was a pity that there was a huge limitation to divine spirit attacks. And that was level suppression. Unless Steward Sun's realm exceeded or was equal to Chunshi's, he would never be able to hurt Chunshi with a soul attack. Ants biting an elephant to death. It was obviously impossible. You have a realm, but you don't have the strength to match it. Do you know? You don't even have the right to make me draw my sword. As he spoke, Chunshi stretched out his index and middle fingers, and then, he formed a sword with his fingers and pointed in the air. A green sword gleam suddenly shot out, and it instantly hit Steward Sun's chest. You! Steward Sun stared at his chest in a daze, and his eyes were filled with disbelief. Chunshi originally wanted to test Steward Sun's cultivation, but he didn't expect him to be so weak. In terms of combat power, he reckoned that he was no match for Sunwen. After all, Sunwen's cultivation was accumulated through his own cultivation, bit by bit. How could it be compared to Steward Sun's unorthodox cultivation? Steward Sun was seriously injured, and the restriction that restrained Lin Xian immediately lost its effect. Therefore, after letting out a cry of surprise, Lin Xian suddenly sat up from the altar and threw herself directly into Chunshi's arms. Chunshi. Lin Xian lay on the altar. Although she couldn't move, she was conscious, so she saw everything that happened. She always felt that Chunshi wasn't an ordinary person, and this time it was confirmed. However, this reality was far beyond her imagination. Lin Xian cried loudly in Chunshi's arms. That weeping pear blossom looked like a child who had been wronged outside, and would only cry in front of her parents when she returned home. However, after crying for a while, Lin Xian lay in Chunshi's arms and murmured softly, "Chunshi, Chunshi, Chunshi." Hearing her mutter his name, Chunshi could only smile awkwardly. He then gently pushed her away and comforted her softly. "It's okay, I'm here. Don't be afraid." After Chunshi pushed Lin Xian away, she seemed to have sobered up a lot. Therefore, after looking deeply at Chunshi with her red eyes, she quickly lowered her head and said softly with a sobbing tone, "Thank you. You saved me again." The atmosphere between the two of them was rather ambiguous, and they simply treated Li Xiaowen and Steward Sun as if they didn't exist. Chunshi didn't kill Steward Sun directly because he wanted to keep him alive, and used this opportunity to understand the Zhenli sect. However, Chunshi didn't expect that. Even though Steward Sun was seriously injured, a fierce look flashed across his face before he collapsed. While Lin Xian was talking to Chunshi, Steward Sun mustered all his strength, took off the cross on his neck, and threw it at the statue of Jesus. The moment the bloody cross hit the statue of Jesus, a strong ray of light suddenly bloomed in the church. Something unexpected happened. Chunshi couldn't care so much anymore. He could only pull Lin Xian into his arms. Following that, he hugged Lin Xian with his left hand and made a grabbing motion in the air with his right hand. The godly sword Dharma power suddenly appeared in his hand. The reason why he was so vigilant was because there was suddenly a strong wave of true yuan in the church. The strength of the movement. Chapter 308. Holy light bloomed, and the gospel was sung. A dazzling door of light that was like a lake appeared out of thin air right in front of the statue of Jesus. The door of light emitted tens of thousands of golden rays. Looking from afar, it looked like sunlight reflected in the water. After the sunlight was refracted by the lake, it began to jump gently along with the ripples on the lake's surface, causing countless golden spots of different sizes to appear on the church's walls and dome. Looking from afar, It was as if countless little elves were dancing on the church's dome. If a devout Christian saw this scene, he would probably be so scared that he would kneel on the ground on the spot and shout that Christ had shown his holiness. Unfortunately, Li Xiaowen and Manager Sun did not believe in Christianity, but in the very mysterious Church of Truth. As the door of light opened, a huge amount of true essence leaked out from the door of light. The so-called leakage originally referred to chemical substances that should not have flowed out or leaked out of the mechanical equipment without anyone noticing, thus causing unnecessary losses. But now what was leaking out from the door of light was not some chemical substance, but the true essence that was painstakingly refined by immortal cultivators. True essence was obtained by immortal cultivators through cultivation bit by bit. So theoretically speaking, it was impossible for it to leak. It was also because of this that once the true essence leaked out, there was basically only one reason, and that was, when immortal cultivators accidentally went berserk during cultivation, they would no longer be able to control the true essence in their body as they wished. For such a situation, there was a word that could vividly describe it, and that was incontinence. Chun Shi shielded Lin Xian behind him, then carefully observed the movement in the door of light. Ever since the door of light appeared, an extremely fanatical expression appeared on Manager Sun's face. He was clearly seriously injured, but now he was as if nothing had happened. He knelt on the ground with a flushed face, raised his hands and shouted loudly, "Father, show your holiness. Have mercy on us. Purify everything in this world that dares to disobey you." As soon as he finished this strange prayer, Manager Sun's face suddenly flushed red. He looked extremely like a religious fanatic who was drunk. However, just as Manager Sun was extremely excited, a red light suddenly shot out from the door of light, directly hitting Manager Sun's glabella. Then, as if he had been electrocuted, his whole body began to tremble violently, and he couldn't help but let out a painful howl. "Ah, it hurts." The wailing stopped abruptly. After that, Steward Sun's appearance aged at a speed visible to the naked eye. His head of black hair looked as if it had been painted with spray paint, turning snow white in an instant. In the blink of an eye, Steward Sun had turned into an old man with a head full of white hair and a withered face. What's going on? What did I do? Steward Sun's voice was hoarse as he stared at his arm, dumbfounded. His arm, like an eggplant that had lost its moisture, it was full of wrinkles and shriveled, looking particularly horrifying. Perhaps it was because he was unable to accept everything before his eyes. Steward Sun once again let out a mournful wail. But this wail didn't last long. It was as if Steward Sun's neck was suddenly choked by someone. He instantly lost his voice and could only lie paralyzed on the ground, twitching weakly. But after twitching a few times, Steward Sun lay on the ground, completely dead. Looking at the dehydrated corpse in front of him, Li Xiaowen was stunned. But when he finally came back to his senses, put down the Holy Grail, and was about to escape this godforsaken place, a black shadow suddenly appeared in the light door. It was a person whose entire body was shrouded in a black cloak. That person only revealed half of his face. But just based on this half of his face, it was enough to tell that he should be an old man. The old man walked out of the light door, then asked such a question in a hoarse voice. "Who alarmed me?" After saying that, he slowly removed the cloak, revealing his true appearance. This was an old man whose eyebrows were stained with silver frost. His weather-beaten face was engraved with the traces of time. Although his pair of brown eyes were deep in his eye sockets, the gaze in them was very calm. He looked exceptionally kind and amiable, just like the old grandpa next door who lay in the district's garden and basked in the sun every day. The old man calmly asked the question, but no one answered him. After all, the only person who knew who he was, Steward Sun, was now lying on the ground as a dried corpse. In reality, the light door was a teleportation array. The key to activate the array was the cross hanging in front of Steward Sun's chest, but the energy required to activate the array required all of his essence and blood. Steward Sun activated the array excitedly. But what he definitely didn't expect was that when the array was activated, it would take his life, and even his soul was not spared. His soul was destroyed. Death wasn't scary. What was scary was not even knowing how one died. After taking a deep look at the light door, Chunxi couldn't help but feel sad for Steward Sun. Such a loyal subordinate was abandoned just like that. Just from this point alone, the old man in front of him was really a qualified evil cultivator. Chunxi held the divine sword Dharma idol in his hand and kept sizing up the old man in front of him. Lin Xian, on the other hand, carefully hid behind him. Because her line of sight was blocked by the altar, she didn't know that Steward Sun was now a dried corpse. Chapter 309. A cold light flashed. The old man suddenly attacked, but Chunxi's reaction was not slow in the slightest. This sword was like a silver hook. After drawing a beautiful arc in the air, it directly cut the old man's arm. The tip of the sword entered the flesh, and suddenly there was a tearing sound. Immediately after, the old man's arm fell from his body very smoothly, as if it had been cut by a laser. Lin Xian was stunned by what happened in front of her eyes. She hid behind Chunxi, maintaining her previous posture. After seeing the long sword in Chunxi's hand cut the old man's arm, her mind suddenly went blank. She could not help but open her small mouth, her face full of shock. That dazed look, it gave people a silly and cute feeling. Lin Xian was so frightened that she could not speak. Her eyes were fixed on the severed arm falling from the air. However, the moment the severed arm fell to the ground, it suddenly turned into a cloud of black smoke and dissipated. It looked like a piece of dried straw paper that had been burned to ashes. When the wind blew, it immediately disappeared without a trace. Chunxi, this. Lin Xian's eyes widened. Before she could finish her words, she found that her body was flying back uncontrollably. Stay there, don't move. After using his essential essence to send Lin Xian to a safe place, Chunxi did not forget to remind her. Then, holding the long sword in his hand, he directly attacked the old man. Lin Xian was just an ordinary person, so the scene she saw was completely different from what Chunxi saw. In fact, in Chunxi's eyes, the old man's skin hidden under the cloak had already fallen off. Most of his muscles had also rotted away, revealing sections of white bones. What kind of person was this? It was simply an old rotten corpse that had crawled out of the grave. If it was just a skeleton, it would be fine. After all, Chunxi had lived for 500 years and had seen all kinds of strange things. Naturally, he would not take a living dead person to heart. The reason why he was so cautious was mainly because the skeleton in front of him was not simple. From the moment the old man walked out of the light door, Chunxi sensed a huge amount of essential essence leaking from the old man's body. But a little strange was, although the amount of essential essence was huge, it gave people a turbid and filthy feeling. If Chunxi's essential essence was as clear as a lake, then the old man's essential essence was like oil on one side and turbid on the other. It was really strange. And because of the essential essence leaking from the old man's body, in Chunxi's eyes, the old man was more like a charcoal that walked out of a fire, his whole body emitting thick billowing smoke. Not long after, the black smoke emitted from the old man's body filled the entire church. In addition, during the confrontation with the old man, Chunxi also focused on the light door behind him. This light door was somewhat similar to the Heavenly Gate, but it could not be compared to the Heavenly Gate. After all, the Heavenly Gate required the support of a huge amount of spiritual energy to open, but this light door in front of him only needed Manager Sun, a pseudo-core stage living sacrifice. If it was another world behind the Heavenly Gate, then behind the light door was obviously just an illegally expanded basement. There was a fundamental difference between the two. And this kind of illegally built basement was actually a small world or a small paradise that was opened up in the void after immortal cultivators comprehended the true meaning of the word void. What was void? This was a very abstract concept. Chunxi was still at the soul formation stage, so naturally, he could not understand the true meaning of it. The so-called insightful void was to see the small and see the big picture, to see through the void. My heart's desire, no matter how vast the world is, it is only an inch. The insightful void was an existence above the soul formation stage. Even if it was not as unattainable as the immortal emperor, it was at least a supreme existence, and could be considered to be at the top of the food chain. Therefore, The light door in front of him obviously could not have been opened up by this old man who had one foot in the grave. If Chun-Shi guessed correctly, this small paradise should be an existence similar to the Temple of Time, which was left behind by the ancient immortal cultivators before they left the earth. The old man was just a dove that took over the magpie's nest. If that was the case, then this ghastly old man in front of him, what kind of existence was he? Although Chun-Shi had a lot of questions in his mind, his hands did not stop moving at all. After cutting off the old man's arm, Chun-Shi immediately turned the sword and pointed it at the old man's chest. The godly sword Dharma idol drew a beautiful arc in the air. The sword light was cold and piercing to the bone. Like a meteor streaking across the sky, it drew a bright silver line in the pitch-black night. Then the godly sword Dharma idol sank into the old man's chest and directly pierced through him, from the beginning to the end. The old man did not make any movements to fight back. Even when his arm was chopped off, he didn't make a sound. Seeing this, Chun-Shi could not help but raise his eyebrows as if he had realized something. So he immediately let go of the long sword in his hand, and suddenly put his hands together in front of his chest, ready to make a gesture. However, just as Chun-Shi was making the gesture, the old man suddenly let out a burst of wild laughter. Immediately after, his body suddenly turned from solid to illusory, as if he had been snapped by Thanos. In an instant, he turned into thousands of powder and disappeared in front of Chun-Shi's eyes. Chun-Shi quickly looked up, only to see black smoke billowing above the church, like the sky before a shower, as if it would collapse at any time. At this time, the old man's voice suddenly sounded from all directions of the church. "Little kid, you're a bit interesting. Come on, let this old man weigh how much weight you have." As soon as the voice fell, the black smoke that was originally floating above the church slowly flowed. It was unknown what method the old man used, but the billowing black smoke suddenly turned into a solid substance, and then it turned into a giant python that was dozens of meters long out of thin air. The giant python formed by the black smoke coiled into a ball in the air, and its huge body almost covered the entire dome. Its head was in the shape of an inverted triangle. From the moment it appeared, the giant python stuck out its head, spat out its snake tongue, and stared at Chun-Shi with its pair of golden vertical pupils. A suffocating sense of oppression gradually spread in the church. Lin Xian stared at the giant python that suddenly appeared above the church, stunned. When she saw the palm-sized scales on the giant python's body, she was so scared that her eyes rolled back and she fainted directly. Lin Xian's fainting attracted Chun-Shi's attention. However, the moment he was distracted, the giant python was like a long arrow that was shot out from a fully drawn bow, opening its bloody mouth and directly pouncing towards Chun-Shi's position. Fortunately, Chun-Shi's reaction was extremely fast. Pretending to be mysterious, accompanied by an angry shout, Chun-Shi suddenly separated his hands, and 2 rays of golden light suddenly bloomed from his palms. When the giant python was about to bite him, Chun-Shi was like a llama holding 2 large symbols in his hands, and suddenly slapped out with both palms, ruthlessly hitting the giant python's head. The giant python was formed by the black smoke, and the black smoke was the true yuan that leaked from the old man's body. Therefore, this was actually a contest of true yuan. The true yuan in Chun-Shi's body was clear and pure, but the true yuan in the old man's body was filthy and turbid. When the two came into contact, it was like throwing metallic sodium into water, and immediately caused a violent explosion. The 8-leaf seal. Chapter 310. The old man in front of him was very strange. Even with Chun-Shi's experience, he did not know what kind of cultivation method the old man was cultivating. Naturally, he could not determine the old man's exact strength. The only thing he could be sure of was, the old man had accumulated too much true origin in his body. It was so much that it was unbelievable. However, at the same time, because this huge amount of true origin was too turbid, the old man was unable to control the true origin in his body as he wished. Hence, after much consideration, Chun-Shi finally put down the long sword in his hand and decided to meet the giant python head-on. He wanted to use this to determine the old man's true strength. The Great Vajrawheel seal was not the most lethal move among the 8-leaf seals, but it was the most powerful one. If one were to compare the Great Vajrawil seal with the most lethal move, the heaven-flipping seal, it would be like the difference between a mace and a long sword. Hence, the moment Chen Shi's palms landed on the giant python's head, the giant python was like a train that had crashed into a wall. Its huge body immediately froze in mid-air. At the same time, with Chen Shi's position as the center of the circle, an invisible shockwave suddenly erupted. Wherever the shockwave went, the tables, chairs, doors, windows, and even the steel bars in the walls of the church were all reduced to dust. Dust flew everywhere, and smoke rose into the air. In the blink of an eye, the solemn church had been completely reduced to ruins. Just the shockwave from the collision alone was so powerful. One could only imagine how powerful this move was. The giant python let out a loud hiss. Then, its body suddenly cracked inch by inch as if it was made of glass and gradually fell apart. In the end, the giant python turned into a plume of black smoke and slowly dissipated in the sky above the church. However, although the giant python had disappeared, the black smoke that enveloped the church showed no signs of dissipating. Seeing this, Chen Shi's face couldn't help but reveal a cold smile. After this head-on battle, he had more or less figured out the old man's strength. Hence, Chen Shi lightly shook his wrist and reached out with his right hand. The divine sword avatar appeared in his hand again. At this moment, the old man's voice suddenly rang out from the black smoke. "Who are you?" He spoke very slowly, and there was even a hint of seriousness in his tone. It was obvious that he had finally realized that the young man before him was no saint. "You wouldn't know him even if I told you." Chen Shi brandished the sword in his hand, then looked at the black smoke with a mocking expression and asked, "What's wrong? Are you afraid? How dare you?" The old man flew into a rage. His voice was like a thunderclap, echoing in the black smoke. "Ignorant brat, you don't know the immensity of heaven and earth. Do you know that even Divine General Tian Du wouldn't dare to be so impudent in front of this old man?" "Divine General?" Hearing this, Chen Shi seemed to have heard a joke, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "I've already killed a few of them." After saying that, Chen Shi suddenly flew up, and the divine sword Dharma power in his hand suddenly exploded with a dazzling light. The reason why Chen Shi chose to attack at this time was that he had thoroughly understood the old man's background. If he guessed correctly, the strange soul-ferrying corpse infant should have been created by this old man. Perhaps it was because of the lack of inheritance, so when the old man relied on this evil technique to form a fake golden core, he had completely embarked on a path of no return. One had to admit that this old man was quite impressive. He didn't even have a real golden core, but he had already begun to explore the method of forming yuanying. What to do if there was no path? Then he had to open up a new path. By relying on constantly stealing other people's souls and essence to strengthen himself, the old man had actually opened up a path that was completely different from others. If one followed the conventional path of cultivation, then after repeatedly refining the golden core until it was pure and ethereal, one could use this golden core as a foundation to form yuanying. If the golden core was compared to a seed, then yuanying was obviously the fruit of the seed after it sprouted and bloomed. Therefore, without a golden core, it was naturally impossible to form yuanying. But in this world, there were always exceptions. Perhaps it was because of his rich imagination. When the old man realized that he couldn't break through to yuanying, he thought of a method that Chen Shi had never heard of before. That was, using his own physical body as a foundation, he could turn his entire being into something similar to yuanying. One had to know that yuanying was just a form of energy. Turning himself into a yuanying, wouldn't he have to turn himself into a ghost? Half human, half ghost? And this was the real reason why Chen Shi couldn't hurt the old man. After all, in this sky full of black smoke, every wisp, it was all his fault. He didn't even have a body, so naturally he wouldn't be hurt. Therefore, if Chen Shi really wanted to kill the old man, he had to completely destroy this black smoke, not leaving a single wisp behind. Otherwise, the old man would sooner or later use the method of plundering to return him to his peak. Getting rid of evil for the people was a great thing. As an outstanding young man in the new era, Chen Shi naturally killed every single one of these scourges he saw, as a way to accumulate good karma. Thus, after understanding the old man's background, Chunshi flew into the sky like a sharp sword. Then he held the godly sword Dharma idol in his hand and waved it in the air. Suddenly 7 identical longswords appeared beside him. Every single one of them was the same as the godly sword Dharma idol in his hand. Although the old man didn't know what Chunshi was going to do, he knew that it wasn't simple just by looking at his posture. Thus, before Chunshi launched his attack, the black smoke in the air surged violently. The black smoke gathered in one place, and in the blink of an eye, it actually turned back into a giant python with 3 heads. It coiled in the air, and madly flicked its tongue at Chunshi. The 7 longswords hung in the air. The 3-headed giant python raised its heads high, as if it could pounce on Chunshi at any time. At this moment, Chunshi suddenly waved the long sword in his hand, the tip of the sword pointing directly at the ruins of the church. The 7 longswords immediately seemed to have received an order, turning into 7 streams of light and shooting towards the ground. The 3-headed giant python thought that the swords were going to shoot at it, so it let out an earth-shattering hiss. However, what the old man didn't expect was that the longsword's target wasn't it at all. After the 7 longswords shot into the ruins of the church, they suddenly shot out 7 towering beams of light like searchlights that were electrified. The 7 beams of light were slanted, converging on the longsword in Chunshi's hand. The old man sensed that danger was approaching, so he raised the 3 ferocious snake heads and pounced directly at Chunshi's position. But it was a pity it was too late. Chunshi shouted angrily, "Formation rise!" A conical light shield that covered the entire church slowly rose in the night sky. Since this old thief was neither a human nor a ghost, and could transform into thousands of bodies, Chunshi could only cast an inescapable net and take him down in one fell swoop. Heavenly slaying formation. After Chunshi's sincere flattery, this little thing was obviously more active. Like a husky taking a walk, she did not even need Chunshi to carry her. She ran downstairs like the wind. Nian, run slower. Don't fall. Qin Ruoying hurriedly followed, but she had just taken a few steps when she heard the little thing let out a cry of surprise. Ah! Qin Ruoying was shocked. After quickly running downstairs, she saw Nian running out of the building like a wisp of smoke. Then she happily threw herself into the arms of a person. "Hello, sister." The person who came was actually Lin Xian. Qin Ruoying looked at her with some surprise, then quickly stepped forward and asked, "Xian, when did you come? Why didn't you call me first?" "I said I would call you when I arrived, but I didn't expect to see you go out as soon as I arrived. What a coincidence." Lin Xian smiled and explained. But when Qin Ruoying looked at her, there was still a trace of suspicion in her eyes. After all, they were classmates and best friends for many years, so she felt that Lin Xian was a little strange today. Could it be? Chapter 314. Actually, Lin Xian had always known their address, but because the couple had left one after another, she hadn't visited them for many years. Since she was a guest, she couldn't possibly not even let her through the door, right? Therefore, Qin Ruoying repeatedly invited Lin Xian upstairs, but Lin Xian shook her head repeatedly, saying that she was just passing by to see Nian and would leave soon. Passing by? See Nian? Could she be more careful? Qin Ruoying knew that she was looking for an excuse, but because she couldn't persuade her, she could only accompany her outside the building, chatting while waiting for Chunshi to come downstairs. In fact, the moment the little fellow exclaimed, Chunshi had already used his divine sense to detect Lin Xian's arrival. Therefore, after he packed up and closed the door, he greeted Lin Xian with a smile from afar. "Oh, What a rare guest. That natural action and expression made it seem as if he was greeting a neighbor that he had a good relationship with. It seemed particularly casual and enthusiastic. This kind of natural behavior also gave Lin Xian an illusion in her days. The current him, and the him last night. Were they really the same person? Su Shi once said. A brave man is not alarmed when faced with a sudden attack, he is not angry when provoked. Even if Mount Tai collapses in front of him, his expression will not change, and his eyes will not blink when the elk rises to the left. This should be the kind of person he was talking about. Lin Xian stared blankly at Chen Shi until Qin Ruoying patted her in puzzlement, and she finally came back to her senses. Xian, it's rare for you to come. Why don't you go to the park with us today, and play with Nian while you're at it? As if to hide her strangeness, Lin Xian quickly nodded and quickly replied, Okay, let's go. I just drove today. You guys wait for me at the gate. I'll go get the car. After saying that, she handed the little fellow to Qin Ruoying and quickly ran towards the gate of the district. Looking at her flustered appearance, Qin Ruoying was really confused, so she looked at Chen Shi and asked, What's wrong with her? I feel that she's a little strange today. Maybe I scared her last night. It's my fault. I should have knocked her out when I went last night. The couple looked at each other helplessly and felt that this matter was a bit troublesome. In fact, it wasn't that Chen Shi didn't have the means to erase memories, but this kind of magic more or less had some side effects. Lin Xian was a friend, so he naturally could not use these methods on her. However, how could she, an ordinary person, calmly accept all of this? If she hadn't been so agitated last night, how could she have done such a series of abnormal actions today? What a headache! Because of the little fellow's presence, the adults tacitly put this matter aside for the time being. Chapter 315. Fight and Kill? After hearing Chen Shi's words, Lin Xian's expression darkened, as if something had touched her heart. Seeing her hesitant look, Chen Shi was a little puzzled. Thus, after pondering for a while, he smiled and explained, Actually, practicing martial arts is quite easy. If you really want to learn, I can teach you. You can just treat it as if you're practicing Tai Chi. Chen Shi's idea was very simple. He could casually teach Lin Xian some basic Qi refining methods. It could strengthen her body and extend her life. At the same time, it could give her more means of self-defense. This could also prevent her from encountering something similar to last night. After all, to a normal person, it would take a lot of mental fortitude to endure 2 kidnappings. After Chen Shi's suggestion, Lin Xian didn't immediately reply. Instead, she turned her head to look at Yingying and Nian who were playing not far away. Looking at this classmate, friend, and best friend who was already a mother, and then looking at the lively and cute little fellow beside her, Lin Xian suddenly felt an indescribable bitterness in her heart. She always felt that Yingying was like Mr. Chao Shuachin's description in Dream of the Red Chamber. When she's quiet, she's like a beautiful flower shining on the water. When she moves, she's like a weak willow swaying in the wind. The heart has one more orifice than the body, and the sickly Shizi wins by 3 points. Although Yingying usually looked weak, she was definitely not a pretentious woman. She was gentle, low-key, and reserved. If it wasn't for that beautiful face, it would be easy for people to overlook her existence. After so many years in Lin Xian's impression, the only time Yingying showed off her ability was probably when she publicly rejected Zhao Yuan's love and threw herself into Chen Shi's arms. At that moment, not to mention Chen Shi, even she, a woman, was stunned by Yingying's actions. Speaking of which, it was laughable. It was also from that moment onwards that she truly began to notice Chen Shi. This piece of gold that had yet to shine. Lin Xian stood there in a daze as memories of the past flooded his mind. For a moment he actually stood there in a daze. Chen Shi thought that she was thinking, so after a while, he asked with a smile, What do you think? Would you like to learn? Chen Shi's voice pulled Lin Xian back from his chaotic thoughts. She glanced at Chen Shi with a slightly panicked expression before replying, When are you going back to Shangjing? Soon, probably within the next few days. Nian is going to kindergarten. It's time to bring her back to get used to it. Oh, Lin Xian went silent again. She buried her head and didn't speak for a long time. Because she was half a head shorter than Chen Shi, if Chen Shi didn't use his divine sense, he naturally wouldn't be able to see the expression on her face. Lin Xian was indeed a bit strange today. The sudden turn of events stunned everyone. Chen Shi hurriedly hugged her and comforted her patiently. However, the little thing was crying while reaching out her hands to Qin Ruoying. Mama. Mama. No matter how naughty and mischievous a child was, she was still just a child. When her peers were ostracizing her and mocking her, how strong did this child have to be to silently bear all this? Mama. Mama. The little thing lay on Qin Ruoying's shoulder and cried heartbreakingly. Mother and daughter were connected by heart. When Qin Ruoying saw her sad look, she suddenly felt touched and couldn't help but cry. She quickly hugged the little thing even tighter. Nian, don't cry, don't cry. Mother is here, don't cry, don't cry. A child's mood was like the weather in June, it could change at any time. Qin Yongyan never thought that his casual question would touch on this little thing's sad matter. However, these sad things had happened a long time ago, so after Qin Ruoying gently comforted her for a while, the little thing slowly stopped crying. Chen Shi stood by the side and didn't say anything. Seeing that the little fellow's emotions were gradually calming down, he let out a heavy sigh of relief. His daughter was already 5 years old, and as a father, it was his first time preparing a birthday present for his daughter. It had been 5 years. When he thought of this, there was only one thought left in Chen Shi's mind. I love you, so I want to give the whole world to you. And this was the deepest and most profound feeling he had for Nian. People called it when the tide receded, the whole would spew out the things that were previously swallowed. So no creature was willing to settle down here. Such a natural deep-sea cave was definitely a place that explorers would dream of. But it was a pity. The hole was very small, almost the size of an elevator door. It was impossible for a large deep-sea submarine to enter. Chen Shi used his qi to protect his body, and quickly swam through the depths of the cave like a sailfish. The cave was very deep and complicated. There were many passages connected. Each passage went left and right, and connected to small caves one after another. It was like a spider web maze, and there was no telling where the end was. There was no light in the cave, so Chen Shi lit up a light ball. Where the light reached, all kinds of underwater plants immediately reflected colorful light. Like a flexible fish swimming through the cave, after about 2 or 3 minutes, Chen Shi came to the end of the cave. Then he directly floated to the surface of the water. This place, it turned out to be a waterless cave. It was like an inverted cup in a basin. Because there was air in the cave, the seawater could not rush in. This was common knowledge in physics that even elementary school students knew. But it was impossible to find such a place in reality. Unless, the walls of the cave were specially processed to withstand the pressure and erosion of the seawater, to ensure that the air in the cave would not leak, and to maintain a stable air pressure, thus resisting the pressure of the seawater. Obviously, this cave had been modified by Chen Shi, otherwise, it was impossible for the seawater not to rush in. The cave was about 40 to 50 meters deep, 10 meters wide, and 7 to 8 meters high. The end of the pool was slightly narrower, looking like an egg. Chen Shi pushed the light ball in his hand into the air, and the strong light suddenly illuminated the entire cave. In the cave, there were people. Chen Shi looked up and saw 2 people floating in the air with their arms and legs spread out. They looked like Jesus on the cross. So have you thought about it? Chen Shi slowly walked into the depths of the cave. As he walked, he said this to the 2 of them. Chen Shi's voice was not loud, but after his voice fell, the cave kept echoing for a long time. Cough. After hearing Chen Shi's words, one of them immediately twitched a few times. However, he was firmly bound in the air by an invisible force, so he could only barely shake his head. Cough, cough. This person coughed heavily a few times, then slowly raised his head. His hair was messy, and his long hair covered half of his face, but it still did not cover his eyes that were filled with hatred. This person, it was actually Bai Hong.